Welcome back to the Quiet Apothecary. Settle in wherever you are tonight. Let the weight of the day slide gently from your shoulders, and let your breathing slow to the pace of a candle flame that has nowhere in particular to be. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere else you need to go. Tonight we turn to a small, quiet puzzle, the sort of thing that seems almost obvious once it is said aloud, and yet grows more remarkable the longer you sit with it. The woods and ditches and hedgerows of medieval Europe were full of plants that could kill a grown person in a single afternoon. Hemlock stood in the damp margins of the lane. The nightshades trailed their dark berries along the hedge. Yew grew in every churchyard, and monkshood raised its hooded blue flowers in more than one cottage garden. These were not rare or hidden things. They grew quite openly, an arm's length from the plants that fed a family and healed its small hurts, and almost nobody in that world could read a single word. By every reckoning we might expect, this should have been a slow and constant tragedy. A landscape thick with poison, walked daily by people with no printed guide, no warning label, no chemist's shop to run to. And yet the burial grounds of medieval Europe were not filled with the accidentally poisoned. It happened now and then, as we shall see, gently, later in our evening. But it was rare, genuinely, quietly rare. And the reason is the thing we have gathered here to think about tonight. The reason was knowledge, not the written kind, kept behind the locked doors of a monastery library, but a living, spoken, hand-to-hand knowledge, carried in memory by ordinary people who could not have told you a word of Latin, and who nonetheless could walk a hedgerow in the half-dark and name every plant in it, and tell you which would feed you, which would heal you, and which you must never, ever put in your mouth. There is no need to remember any of this. Let the facts drift past you like leaves on slow water. We have a long, unhurried night ahead of us. And if your eyes close somewhere along the way, that was always the whole point of the evening. Let us begin with the world itself and the green that covered it. To understand how carefully medieval people knew their plants, it helps first to picture just how much plant there was, and how close it pressed against every part of ordinary life. We live now at a certain distance from the growing world. Our food arrives cleaned and cut and wrapped, gathered by hands we will never meet, from fields we will never see. For the medieval villager, there was no such distance at all. The green world began at the doorstep and did not stop. It grew up the walls of the cottage, along the edges of every path, in the ditch, in the hedge, in the churchyard, in the waste ground by the midden, in the very thatch of the roof overhead. A person could not step outside without touching it, and this green world was not decoration. It was the larder, the medicine chest, the dye pot, the thatch, the bedding, the winter fodder, and the fuel, all at once. A single hedgerow, that long tangled ribbon of hawthorn and blackthorn and hazel that divided one field from the next, might supply a family with sloes for a winter cordial, haws and nuts to eat, bark for tanning, straight rods for baskets and hurdles, and a dozen small green things growing in its shelter that went into the pot or the poultice. The hedgerow was not the edge of the useful world. It was the middle of it, because so much of daily survival came directly out of the ground. Ordinary people paid attention to plants in a way that is genuinely difficult for us to imagine now. A modern person might know a rose from a daisy and leave it there. a medieval cottager knew, without effort or pride, perhaps 200 or 300 plants by sight, by season, by smell, by the feel of a leaf between the fingers. This was not scholarship. It was simply competence, the ordinary competence of a person who lived by the land, and would not have survived long without it. In much the same way that we read the faces of the people around us without ever thinking of it as a skill, the medieval villager read the green world. Consider only the plants a household might actually eat, quite apart from any medicine at all. Long before the vegetable garden became the settled, orderly thing we know today, a great part of the green on the table came straight from the wild. Young nettles, gathered in spring with a cloth wrapped round the hand against the sting, made a strengthening pottage after the long, thin months of winter. Fat hen and good King Henry, plants we now pull up as weeds without a second thought, were grown and gathered deliberately for the pot. Dandelion leaves, sorrel, chickweed, watercress lifted from a clean running stream, the tender young tops of hawthorn that country children still call bread and cheese, the first soft shoots of bramble. All of these and a great many more were known, named, and gathered each in its own season. A countrywoman walking to the well and back might return with the makings of a whole meal picked from the verge along the way, and never once break a stride to think about it. And all of this shifted with the turning of the year, which meant the attention never truly rested. Spring was the season of green shoots and bitter leaves, gathered eagerly after the hungry gap of late winter, when the stores ran low and nothing new had yet come up. Early summer brought the flowers, the elderflower and the hawthorn blossom and the first of the wound herbs, gathered at their peak and dried for the year ahead. High summer was the great season of leaf and stem. Autumn turned everything toward the fruits and the roots, the sloes and haws and hips and nuts. The roots dug as the strength of the plant withdrew down into the ground. Each season asked for a different knowledge, a different handful of plants held ready in the mind, and a person who lived by the land carried the whole slow, rolling calendar of it in memory, knowing not only what each plant was but exactly when to want it. This knowledge was also deeply local, rooted in one particular patch of earth. A woman who knew her own valley perfectly might find herself half at a loss in a valley a single day's walk away. Where the soil ran different, the plants grew in unfamiliar places, and even the names had quietly shifted. The knowledge was not a general science of plants, but an intimate acquaintance with these plants. In this hedge, on this bank, beside this stream, learned in one small place across the whole of a life. It was less like a book that could be carried anywhere, and more like the knowledge of a face, particular and unrepeatable. A person did not know plants in the abstract. They knew their own green world, every corner of it, the way they knew the people of their own parish. There was in that world no sharp line drawn between food and medicine, and this too shaped how closely the plants were known. The same pot of pottage that fed a family was also, quietly, its physic, seasoned with the herbs thought to warm a cold stomach, or to ease a heavy one, so that every meal carried a little medicine within it, and every medicine was very often only a particular sort of food. A plant might go into the supper one day, and into a poultice the next, and the goodwife who reached for it made no great distinction between the two uses. To know a plant, then, was never a narrow or a specialist thing. It was to know a food, a remedy, perhaps a dye or a strewing herb or a small blessing, all folded together in the one green growing thing. And this many-sidedness meant that plants were turned over in the mind and the hand constantly, from every angle, until they were known as thoroughly as anything in that world was ever known. A knowledge held and used so many times a day, for so many different needs, does not easily slip from the mind. Now, within this dense and useful green, danger was woven through like a dark thread in a bright cloth. It was not set apart in some forbidden corner. The plant that could ease a fever and the plant that could stop a heart might grow within the same square yard of hedge bottom, their leaves overlapping, their roots tangled together in the same damp soil. There was no fence between the safe and the deadly. And this, more than anything, is what makes the everyday safety of these people so quietly astonishing. They did not survive by staying away from the dangerous plants. They could not have. The dangerous plants were everywhere. They survived by knowing them. It is worth pausing on that distinction, because it sits at the heart of everything we shall talk about tonight. There are two ways a person can be safe among dangerous things. One is to keep well clear of them, to build a wall and stay behind it. The other is to know them so thoroughly, so intimately, that the danger holds no surprise. The medieval villager had no wall. What they had instead was the second kind of safety, the deeper kind, the kind that comes from long familiarity. They knew the poisonous plants the way you know a steep stair in your own house in the dark, without needing to see it, without needing to think, simply stepping around it out of a habit worn so smooth it no longer feels like knowledge at all. The old herbals, when they were written down at all, tended to record this knowledge as though it were a marvel, a special learning belonging to physicians and scholars. But the truth, as far as we can now tell it, is that the greater part of it lived nowhere near a physician. It lived in the heads of goodwives and shepherds, of children and old men, of the woman who sold bunches of herbs at the market, and the boy who drove the geese along the green lane. It was the common inheritance of nearly everyone, held so widely and so quietly that hardly anyone thought it worth writing down. That, in the end, is why we have to reconstruct it now with such care. It was too ordinary, in its own time, to record. And so we begin our night not with a single plant, nor a single healer, but with this larger picture, a world drenched in green, where food and medicine and poison grew tangled together within reach of every hand, walked by people who could not read but who carried, in living memory, one of the most complete bodies of plant knowledge the world has ever held. Hold that picture gently as we go. Everything else tonight is simply an attempt to understand how such a thing was possible. Let us turn now to where it all began, in the earliest years of a medieval life, long before a child could read or reason or even properly speak. A modern child learns the alphabet before very much else. A medieval child learned the plants first. This was not a decision anyone made, not a plan set down by a teacher or a parish. It was simply the shape of the world a child was born into. Letters, for most, would never come at all. But plants came at once, because plants were everywhere the child was, and because a great deal of a small child's safety depended on learning quickly which of the bright and tempting things growing all around must never be picked up and eaten. Picture, if you will, the smallest years of that life. a cottage with a single low room, a door standing open to the yard, and beyond it the green pressing in on every side. A very young child, barely walking, is not kept indoors as we might keep one now. There is work to be done, and the child goes where the mother goes, carried on a hip, set down in a shaded corner of the garden, watched with one eye while the other eye watches the pot. And all around that child, within easy reach of a curious hand, grow the most dangerous plants in the whole of Europe. This is the first thing to understand about how the knowledge was passed on. It began not with lessons but with prohibitions, with a small handful of firm and constant no's, spoken over and over from the earliest age, long before a child could tell you why a plant was dangerous or name the harm it did. The child knew, in the deep and wordless way that very young children know things, that certain plants were simply not to be touched. The shining black berries by the wall, the tall speckled stalk in the ditch, the blue hooded flowers at the garden's edge, these carried, for the medieval child, the same weight of absolute prohibition that a hot hearth or a deep well carried. They belonged to the small, fixed list of things that meant danger, learned before reason, kept for life. The teaching of this was constant and gentle and relentless, in the way that the teaching of small children always is. A mother, seeing a chubby hand reach for the wrong berry, did not deliver a lecture on toxic alkaloids. She said no sharply, and moved the hand away, and perhaps named the plant with a word heavy enough to carry its own warning. Poison berry, dead man's plant, devil's cherries. The names themselves did a great deal of the work, as we shall hear later tonight, because a plant called dead man's bells needs no further explanation to a frightened 4-year-old. The lesson was repeated whenever the situation arose, which in a green world was often, until the avoidance became as natural as breathing. Alongside the prohibitions ran their gentler opposite. The plants a child was allowed, even encouraged, to handle and play with freely, and this too was a kind of teaching. A child might be shown how to make a squealing whistle from a hollow stem, how to string daisies and dandelions into chains and crowns, how to blow the soft clock of a dandelion gone to seed to tell a make-believe hour. The stem that made the whistle, the flower that made the chain, these were safe and known to be safe, and handling them freely built up the other half of the map, the wide green territory of the harmless, between the small fierce list of the forbidden and the broad easy country of the allowed. A child slowly learned the whole shape of the plant world, not as a lesson set before them, but as the ordinary play of a green childhood. There is a tenderness in this that is easy to overlook. We might imagine the medieval countryside as a careless and dangerous place for a child, and in many ways it was, but in this one respect it was watched over with enormous care. The whole community, not only the mother, took part in the teaching. An older sibling would slap a dangerous berry from a smaller hand and repeat the warning learned only a year or two before. A grandmother by the fire would tell, again and again, the small cautionary tales that carried the lessons forward, the story of the child in the next parish who ate the pretty berries, told not to frighten, but to instruct, worn smooth by countless retellings into something closer to a nursery rhyme than a horror. Fear was not the tool. Familiarity was. The dangerous plants were made known, named, pointed out, folded into the ordinary talk of the household, until they held no mystery, and therefore no fatal temptation. As the child grew, the simple Nos began to fill in with reasons and details, though never in any formal way. Gathering herbs with a mother or an aunt, a child of 6 or 7 would be shown, over and over, the small differences that separated a good plant from its dangerous double. This one, with a hairy stem, you may pick. That one, smooth and spotted, you must leave. Smell your fingers after you crush the leaf. If it smells of garlic, it is good. If it smells of nothing, or of something sour and strange, put it down and wash your hands. The lessons were practical, physical, endlessly repeated in the doing, and they sank into the body as much as the mind, so that a grown countrywoman could later sort the safe from the deadly by touch and scent alone, her hands knowing the difference before her mind had named it. More than any spoken lesson, it was work that taught. A child was set to weed the garden bed, and in the weeding learned to tell the wanted plant from the unwanted at a single glance. A child was sent to gather a handful of this or that for the pot, and came home gently corrected if the wrong leaf had been brought. A child helped to sort the day's gathering on the table, spreading the herbs to dry, tying them into small bunches, and in the sorting handled each one 100 times over until its shape and its smell were as familiar as the faces around the supper board. This was an apprenticeship so ordinary that no one would ever have thought to call it one. It had no beginning and no end, no master and no indenture, no fee and no ceremony. It was simply the child made useful and made knowledgeable in the very being useful. As children grew a little older, their learning began to divide along the lines their adult lives would follow, though the most important lessons of all belonged to every one of them alike. A girl kept more about the house and the garden and the still room, learned the herbs of the pot and the sick room in greater depth, the plants a good wife would one day need in order to feed and physic a whole household. A boy, sent out to the fields and the beasts, learned the plants of the pasture and the wood, which were good grazing and which would sicken a cow or a sheep or turn the milk. But the death plants, the truly dangerous ones, belonged to no single trade and no single sex. Every child, girl or boy, housebound or field-ranging, learned those first and learned them equally, because the danger they carried did not care in the least what work a person would grow up to do. By the time a medieval child reached 10 or 11, an age at which we would still be teaching the basics of reading, that child already carried a working knowledge of the local plants that would put many a modern gardener to shame. Not because the child was clever or specially taught, but because the knowledge was in the air of daily life, breathed in from the first year, corrected and deepened every single day. It was, in the truest sense, a mother tongue, learned the way a language is learned, without grammar or effort, simply by living inside it. And this is the quiet foundation beneath everything else we shall talk about tonight. All the rhymes and rules and market inspections and careful doses that we shall come to were built upon this first thing, this deep, early, wordless familiarity laid down in the youngest years before a child could even ask why. The medieval villager rarely poisoned himself for the same reason you do not, most days, walk into walls. The knowledge had been there so long and laid down so early that it had stopped feeling like knowledge at all. Let us turn now to those dangerous plants themselves and meet, one by one and by their gentlest light, the green things that every medieval villager knew never to eat. It would be easy to imagine the dangerous plants of medieval Europe as sinister and hidden things, lurking at the dark edges of the wood. The truth is gentler and stranger than that. They were, for the most part, familiar neighbors, growing in plain sight along the paths a person walked every day of a life, known by name to every child in the parish, and regarded not with dread, but with a calm, matter-of-fact respect. A villager no more feared the hemlock in the ditch than a person today fears the traffic in the street. It was dangerous, certainly, and treated with care, and there was an end to it. Let us walk among them now, slowly, and meet the ones that everyone knew. We begin with hemlock, perhaps the most famous of them all, the plant that carried Socrates out of the world in ancient Athens and grew, all the same, in the damp corners of half the villages of medieval Europe. It stood tall, often taller than a person, its stems smooth and hollow, and marked with dull purple blotches that country folk in some regions called the marks of the devil's fingers, or in others the stains of a saint's blood. Its leaves were finely cut and fern-like, and its flowers grew in the flat white clusters common to its whole family. Every part of it was deadly, and yet it announced itself plainly to anyone who knew the signs. It was said that hemlock could be told by its smell alone, a sharp, unpleasant, mousy scent that rose from the crushed leaf, and warned the nose long before any harm could reach the stomach. A countrywoman gathering greens knew that smell as surely as she knew the smell of sour milk, and drew back from it by instinct. Worse even than the hemlock of the dry lane was its cousin of the water, the cowban of the wet ditch and the marshy pool, which some reckoned the very deadliest plant in all the northern lands. It favoured the standing water where cattle came down to drink, and its thick pale root, if a beast or a person took it, spared very little time. The country people knew it and its haunts exactly, and kept their children and their beasts from the treacherous margins where it grew, and a herdsman watering his cattle watched the pool's edge with this plant in mind, that so deadly a thing did so little harm, in a world where people and animals drank at such places every day, is itself a small monument to how thoroughly its danger was known. From the tall pale hemlock we turn to the nightshades, a whole small family of them, dark and low and buried. The most dangerous was the one the old herbals called deadly nightshade, and later ages called belladonna, the beautiful lady, from an old use of its juice to widen and brighten the eyes. It grew more in the south and the chop country than in the cold north, a tall bushy plant with dull purple bell-shaped flowers, and in late summer, berries of a deep and shining black, sweet to the taste and beautiful to the eye. And this was precisely the danger of it. Where most poisons warned the tongue with bitterness, these berries did not. They tempted. And so this plant, above almost all others, was the one pointed out most sternly to children, named again and again. Its shining berries made an object of firm and early prohibition in every household within its range. Its humbler cousins grew more widely. Woody nightshade, which country people called bittersweet, trailed through the hedges with small purple and yellow flowers and clusters of red berries, less deadly than its black cousin, but still never to be eaten. Black nightshade grew low in the disturbed ground of gardens and field edges, its little berries green then black. These were known, named, and left alone, folded into the common knowledge so early, and so completely that leaving them alone required no thought at all. The old books claim that even the birds knew to take some and refuse others, and the country eye watched the birds and learned. Let us turn now to henbane, a plant with a smell and a look that seemed almost designed to warn. It was a sticky, hairy, sprawling thing, with dull yellowish flowers netted all over with fine purple veins, and it gave off a heavy, clinging, unpleasant odor that clung to the fingers and was not easily forgotten. It grew on waste ground, by walls, near old middens and ruins, in exactly the sort of neglected places a person passed, but rarely lingered. Henbane was genuinely dangerous, and it was also in the careful hands of those who knew it, a genuine medicine, used in the smallest and most cautious amounts to bring sleep and ease pain. That double nature, the poison that was also a remedy, is a thread we shall follow later in our evening. For now it is enough to say that henbane, too, was known to all, its heavy smell a plain warning that even a child could read. We come now to monkshood, which some called wolfsbane, one of the most beautiful of all the dangerous plants, and one of the most deadly. It raised tall spikes of hooded flowers of a deep and lovely blue, so handsome that it was sometimes grown in cottage gardens for the pleasure of the sight alone. Yet its root held a poison so strong that it was said a person might be harmed merely by handling it carelessly with a cut on the hand. And it had been used, in older times, to tip arrows and to kill wolves, from which one of its names came. Because it was grown deliberately and admired for its beauty, monkshood was treated with a particular and careful respect in the households that kept it. Its place in the garden known to all, its root never dug without good reason and clean, whole hands. From the garden we go to the churchyard, and to the yew, that ancient dark tree that stood, and in many places still stands, beside the church in village after village across Europe. The yew was woven so deeply into the life of a community that no one could fail to know it. Its wood made the great longbows. Its shade fell across the graves of a family's own dead, and every part of it. The dark needles, the bark, the seed within the soft red berry, was poison to a person and to cattle alike, a fact known so universally that the churchyard yew was fenced or walled precisely to keep the grazing beasts away from it. The soft red flesh of the berry, oddly, was the one harmless part, sweet and sticky, and children in some regions ate it carefully, spitting out the deadly seed within, a small piece of exact and inherited knowledge passed from older child to younger, without any adult needing to say a word. We turn now to foxglove, tall and stately in the summer hedgebank, its spire of purple thimble flowers nodding over the lane. Foxglove carried a whole cluster of country names that told its nature at once: dead men's bells, and fairy thimbles, and folk's glove, and the very shape of the flowers, so exactly the size of a fingertip, made it one of the most instantly known plants of all. It was poison, and everyone knew it was poison, and yet it was also, in a way the old wise women grasped long before any physician wrote it down, a powerful medicine for a laboring and dropsical heart, given in the tiniest and most careful of doses. We shall return to foxglove later, for its story is one of the finest examples of the whole art we are describing, the art of knowing a dangerous plant so well that its danger became its usefulness. There were others, a whole quiet company of them, lords and ladies, which children called cuckoo pent, with its strange hooded green flower and its spike of bright red berries in autumn. Berries that burned the mouth so fiercely at the first bite that they protected themselves, few children troubling to swallow what had already stung the tongue. White bryony, climbing the hedge with its curling tendrils and red berries, its great roots sometimes dug up and sold by cheats as the fabled mandrake. The hellebores, dark and bitter, kept for their violent use as purges and never mistaken for food. Each of these was known, named, placed on the mental map of the parish, and given exactly as much respect as its danger required, no more and no less. A few more deserve their names spoken, for they were as well known in their day as any. The autumn crocus, which some country people called naked ladies, for the way its pale mauve flowers rose bare from the bare ground in autumn, without a single leaf to clothe them, held a poison that the old physicians used with the greatest of care against the grinding pain of gout, and that everyone else knew simply to leave standing in the meadow where it grew. The little shrub called mesoreon, and its cousin the spurge laurel, tempted the eye with bright berries and repaid the eater with a burning mouth, and were pointed out to children along the shaded woodland edge. The spurges themselves, when broken, wept a milky white sap that blistered the skin, and so warmed the hand long before ever the mouth was in danger. For a great many of the poisonous plants carried exactly this kind of built-in caution, a bitterness, a burning, a foul smell, a stinging sap, almost as though the green world had taken some quiet trouble to label its own dangers for anyone who paid attention. What strikes a person, looking back now at the whole company of them, is how many carried names that were themselves warnings, worn into the common speech over long centuries. Dead men's bells, devil's berries, poison parsley, bad man's oatmeal, which was one old country name for the hemlock. To name a plant for death or for the devil was a way of writing a warning in the one place where every villager could read it, in the shared memory of the spoken tongue. And yet, for all the dark names, there was remarkably little fear in how these plants were treated from day to day. They were simply part of the furniture of the world, dangerous corners to be stepped around, respected the way a person respects deep water or the edge of a sharp blade, without ever losing a single night's sleep over their nearness. And this is the first and simplest answer to the question we began with tonight. Medieval villagers rarely poisoned themselves with the obviously deadly plants for the plainest of reasons, because they knew them. The hemlock in the ditch, the nightshade on the wall, the yew in the churchyard, these held no secret and sprang no trap. They were as familiar as the faces of neighbors, learned in childhood, named in the common speech, avoided by a habit so deep it had stopped feeling like caution at all. The truly dangerous plant, it turns out, was almost never the one that looked dangerous. It was the one that looked like something else. And to that quieter danger we must now turn. Let us turn now to the look-alikes and to the small, careful tests that told a good plant from its deadly double. Here we come to the real test of a countryman's knowledge, and the place where genuine harm, when it came at all, most often came. It was not the obvious poison that caught people out. A person who could tell a hemlock from a hollyhock had done the easy part. The hard part, the part that separated true knowledge from a passing acquaintance, was telling apart two plants that looked, to the careless eye, almost exactly the same. And medieval Europe was full of such pairs, an innocent plant and its dangerous twin, growing side by side, so alike that only a trained eye, or a trained nose, or a trained hand could part them. The worst of these traps lay in a single family of plants, the one the old writers knew simply by its flat white umbrella-shaped flower heads, the family that holds both the humblest kitchen herbs and the deadliest poisons in all of Europe. On the safe side of it stood cow parsley, frothing white along every lane in early summer, harmless and pretty, and its cousins the wild carrot and the sweet cicely, and the parsley and chervil of the garden. On the deadly side stood hemlock, and fool's parsley, and, deadliest of all, the hemlock water dropwort of the wet ditches, whose very roots were sometimes called dead men's fingers, a plant so poisonous that a single mistaken root could kill. To the untrained glance, a hedge full of these plants was a single sea of white flowers. To the trained eye, it was a dozen different plants, each as distinct as a different animal. So how did they tell them apart, these people with no field guide and no book? They did it with the body, with a handful of small physical tests passed down and practiced until they were automatic. The first was the stem. Cow parsley, the safe plant, had a stem that was ridged and often faintly hairy and solid within. Hemlock, the deadly one, had a stem that was smooth, hollow, and marked with those telltale purple blotches. Where I come from, an old saying held that you could trust the plant with hairy legs, and never the one with the smooth spotted stockings, and a child was taught to run a thumb up the stem and feel for the roughness or the smoothness before ever trusting a leaf. The second test was the smell, and it was perhaps the surest of all. A great many of the dangerous plants of this family carried a rank, mousy, unpleasant smell when their leaves were bruised, while the safe ones smelled green and fresh, or sweet, or of aniseed. A gatherer crushed a leaf between finger and thumb and lifted it to the nose before anything else, and the nose, which learns a smell once and keeps it for life, gave its verdict at once. It was said in some places that the good plants smelled of the kitchen and the bad ones smelled of the grave, and however fanciful the saying, the instinct behind it was sound. The berry plants had their own hard doubles. Elder, whose flowers made a cordial, and whose dark berries made a syrup for the winter cough, had a low-growing cousin called danewort or dwarf elder, very similar in its clusters of dark fruit, but far less safe, and the countrywoman knew to take her elderberries only from the tall woody bush and never from the low herb that died back each year. The good blackberry of the bramble grew tangled through the very same hedges as the red berries of bryony and the black berries of nightshade, and a child gathering brambles was taught, before ever being trusted with a basket, exactly which fruit belonged to the bramble's own arching thorny cane, and which belonged to the smooth climbing stems threaded through it. The rule was learned young and held for life. Eat only the berry you can name and trace back to its own leaf and stem. There was also the great family of the bulbs, and the sword-shaped leaves, where wild garlic, the ramsons that carpeted the spring woods with its broad green leaves and white star flowers, grew in the very same damp shade as the young leaves of lords and ladies, and in some places near the leaves of lily of the valley, and the autumn crocus, all of them poisonous, all of them, before the flowers came, faintly resembling that good and much-loved spring green. Here again the nose did the work the eye could not. Crush a leaf of wild garlic and it smells unmistakably of garlic. Crush the leaf of any of its dangerous doubles, and it smells of nothing, or of something green and cold and wrong. The test was simple, the rule absolute, and a child learned it as one of the first great lessons of spring gathering. If it does not smell of garlic, it is not garlic, and you must let it lie. There is a lesson in the very existence of these dangerous doubles, and the country people seem to have grasped it well. The green world did not sort itself neatly into the plainly good and the plainly bad. It set its safest foods and its deadliest poisons in the same families, gave them the same shape of leaf and the same shape of flower, and left it to the knowing eye to tell them apart. A person could not lean on a simple rule that all plants of a certain look were safe, for the look that promised a wholesome pot herb promised also, on the wrong plant, a swift and certain death. Only true knowledge served, knowledge of this plant, and not merely of its kind, and the people met that hard demand with a patience and a care that kept them, year upon year, on the right side of the line. The mushrooms and toadstools were their own separate world of danger, and here the country wisdom was at its most cautious of all, for among the fungi grew the deadliest things in the whole landscape, the pale and innocent-looking cap that country people in later ages would name the death cap, and the destroying angel, plants that killed slowly and surely, and could not always be told from a good field mushroom by any simple test. Faced with this, the wisdom of the villagers was mostly a wisdom of restraint. A handful of safe and unmistakable kinds were gathered, the ones that grew in the open field, that had the right gills and the right smell, and could not be confused with anything worse, and everything else, everything doubtful, everything growing in the dark of the wood, was simply left alone. Where a plant could not be known for certain, the rule was not to guess but to leave it, and this rule, more than any test, was the true guardian against the worst mistakes. There was a wisdom, too, in never gathering entirely alone when it could be helped, and in never trusting a doubtful plant to a single pair of eyes. Gathering was often done in company, a mother and a daughter, two neighbors walking out together, a small band of children under an older girl's charge, and a doubtful leaf would be passed from hand to hand and held up for a second opinion before it ever went into the basket. Where doubt still remained, the plant could be carried home and shown to the oldest and most knowing person in the household, the grandmother by the fire who had seen 80 springs and forgotten none of them, and her word settled the matter. This quiet habit of checking, of not trusting one's own eye alone, was itself a strong safeguard, spreading the knowledge across many heads so that no single mistake could easily slip all the way through. The memory of these dangerous doubles ran very deep, and some of it reached back far beyond the medieval world into the oldest layers of story. The hemlock water dropwort of the wet ditches, deadliest of all the false parsleys, was thought by some of the ancient writers to be the very plant that grew on the island of Sardinia and gave the world an old and haunting phrase, the sardonic smile. From the strange fixed look it was said to leave upon the faces of those it took. Whether or not the old writers had fixed upon the right plant, the story traveled down the centuries alongside the plant's dark reputation, and a countrywoman warning a child away from the dead men's fingers in the ditch was passing on, without ever knowing it, a caution far older than she could have imagined, worn smooth by 100 generations of careful mothers before her. For beneath all the particular tests, the stem and the smell and the leaf, lay one great governing rule, and it is worth holding on to as the heart of this whole part of our evening. Never eat what you cannot name. A person walking the hedgerow did not sort the world into the safe and the poisonous. That was too dangerous a way to think, for it invited a person to eat anything not known to be deadly. Instead, they sorted it into the known and the unknown, and ate only from the known. The unknown plant, however harmless it might look, was simply not food, and was left where it stood. This single habit of mind, humble and unglamorous and endlessly repeated, was perhaps the strongest thread in the whole net of safety, and it caught nearly everything that the sharper tests might miss. Let us turn now to the ways this knowledge was kept and carried, from one head to another and one lifetime to the next, in a world that could not write it down. We come now to a question that sits underneath everything we have said so far. If almost no one could read, and almost nothing was written down, then how did all of this knowledge survive at all? How did a body of learning as vast as the plant lore of a whole people pass unbroken from one generation to the next across centuries, without a single book to hold it? The answer is that it lived in memory, and that memory, when it is trained and trusted, and given the right tools, is a far larger and more faithful store than we, who write everything down and remember almost nothing, tend to believe. The chief tool of that memory was rhyme and rhythm, and the small musical shapes that words can be folded into so that they hold together and resist forgetting. There is a reason that so much old knowledge comes down to us in verse, rather than in plain speech. A line of prose, once its exact words are lost, can be filled back in 100 ways and drifts a little further from the truth with each retelling. But a rhyming couplet holds its shape. If you remember the first line, the rhyme itself reaches forward and catches the second, and the rhythm tells you at once if a word has fallen out or been wrongly added. Verse is, in a sense, memory that mends itself, and a people without writing leaned upon it, the way we lean upon the written page. And so the knowledge came in rhymes, thousands of them, small and homely and easily kept. Many a country child learned the cure for a nettle sting not as a fact, but as a little chant, sung while rubbing the sting with the broad green leaf of the dock that so obligingly grew wherever nettles grew. The words varied from place to place, but the shape was always the same. A rhyme that named the dock and named the nettle and told the one to draw out the sting of the other, repeated in time with the rubbing hand. The rhyme did 3 things at once. It told the child which leaf to reach for, it measured out how long to keep rubbing, and it soothed the small hurt with the simple comfort of a familiar sound. A whole small piece of practical medicine, folded into a scrap of verse a 3-year-old could carry. The warnings came the same way. Where a plant was dangerous, a rhyme was often the vessel that carried the danger safely from mouth to mouth. A verse might name the shining berry, and the harm it did in the same breath, so that the sound of the plant's name pulled the warning up behind it, automatically, the way one word of a familiar song brings the next. It was said in many regions that a berry a person could not fit to a rhyme was a berry a person should not eat, for the good and useful fruits had all been sung about time out of mind, and the rhymes were a kind of register of the known, learned so early that to hear the name was to hear the caution. The rhymes measured as well as warned, for many carried a number folded into them, a count of how many leaves to take, or how many times to stir, or how many mornings to drink a certain brew, and the number, fixed within the rhyme, kept the measure from drifting. In a world without clocks or scales, to say a thing in a verse that named its own count was to carry the dose safely along with the cure. The rhyme that told which herb to take told also, in the very same breath, how much, and how often, and for how long, so that the whole of a small remedy, plant and measure and manner together, could be held in a scrap of verse that a child could sing. Beyond the little cures and warnings lay the larger rhymes of the season, the proverbs that tied plant to weather to the turning of the year. Everyone knew that a person should never cast off a warm garment until the May was fully out, the May being the white blossom of the hawthorn that flowered as the true warmth arrived, so that the hedge itself served as a calendar, and a rhyme fixed the lesson in the mind. There were sayings for when to sow and when to reap, for what a heavy crop of haws foretold of the winter to come, for which flowers opening meant which work must now be done. These were not idle country wisdom. They were a farming and gathering calendar, with no paper behind it, kept entirely in the shared memory of a village, and passed down in verses so old that no one could say who first had made them. Work itself carried law, for so much labor in that world was done to a rhythm, and rhythm invites a song, and a song can be made to hold anything a people wishes to remember. Women spinning, grinding, washing, gathering, kept their hands moving to remembered verses, and among the love songs and the laments, and the plain nonsense sung to pass a long task, there ran also the practical rhymes, the ones that told which herb to cut at which moon, how long to steep a certain leaf, how many times to stir a certain brew. The knowledge rode along on the music, learned without effort by anyone within hearing, so that a child sitting by a grinding mother took in the lore of a dozen plants, without ever being sat down and taught a thing. Some of these memory verses grew quite long, and held whole lists of plants together in a single unbroken chant. From the older English tradition there survives one such piece, a charm naming 9 sacred herbs, mugwort and waybread, which we now call plantain, and lamb's cress and nettle and betony and chamomile and crab apple and chervil and fennel, each called upon in turn and praised for its power against sickness and against poison. Whatever a modern listener makes of the charm's older and stranger meanings, its plainer work is easy enough to see. It was a way of holding 9 important healing plants together in the memory, bound into a single rhythmic recitation that could be learned whole and carried for a lifetime. A person who knew the charm knew the 9 herbs, and could no more forget one of them than forget a line from the very middle of a well-loved song. The spoken charms that so often accompanied a remedy were themselves a form of this memory-keeping, and their strict, unchanging word order was part of their reliability. A charm had to be said just so, in the exact words handed down, and this insistence on getting the words precisely right, though it wore the dress of ritual and blessing, also served to keep the accompanying knowledge from drifting. Where the words were fixed, the practice they described tended to stay fixed too. The blessing spoken over the binding of a wound preserved, in its very rigidity, the correct handling of the wound, and a healer who kept the old words exactly was, without perhaps quite intending it, keeping the old and tested method exactly as well. Larger still than the rhymes and the charms were the stories, the long tales told at the fireside through the dark evenings of winter. And these too were vessels for knowledge, some of it plain and some of it deeply hidden. A grandmother telling of the child who ate the pretty berries, or the man who cut the elder without asking leave, or the girl who gathered the right herb by moonlight and saved her mother's life, was not only passing the evening. She was teaching, in the oldest and most powerful way there is, by wrapping the lesson inside a shape that the mind loves and holds fast to, the shape of a story with people in it and a thing that happens. A fact is easily forgotten. A story is not. And so the most important knowledge of all, the knowledge that could save or cost a life, was very often the knowledge entrusted to a tale. What is quietly remarkable is how faithfully all of this held together across the centuries. We might expect that knowledge passed only by word of mouth would blur and wander and decay, and some of it surely did. But when the folklorists of later ages went out into the villages and wrote down the rhymes and charms and sayings still living on the tongues of the old people, they found, again and again, the very same verses recorded centuries earlier in some rare old manuscript, changed hardly at all. The rhyme had protected the words had protected the knowledge. A little chant about a healing leaf, learned by a child in one age, could be recognized almost unaltered on the lips of another child 400 years later. Carried all that way on nothing more than sound and memory and the human love of a tune that rhymes. There was, of course, great variety in the local dress of this knowledge, the same lesson wearing different words from one valley to the next. The nettle rhyme of one county named different plants or set them in a different order from the nettle rhyme of the next. But beneath the variation the substance held remarkably steady, as though each region had wrapped the same sound, plant knowledge in its own particular music. A traveler moving across the country would have heard the same lessons sung in 100 slightly different ways and understood them all, the way one understands the same song set to a new tune. Nor did these rhymes and sayings stay penned within a single household or even a single village. They traveled, carried along the roads by the people who traveled, the peddler with his pack, the wandering singer, the pilgrim, the laborer walking from one harvest to the next. A good rhyme, once heard at a fair or in an alley house or along a dusty road, was easily carried home and repeated. And so useful plant knowledge spread from parish to parish on the very same current that carried the bollards and the news. The market and the fair were not only places to buy and to sell, they were the places where the whole spoken library of the countryside met and mingled and copied itself a little further across the land. This, then, was the great library of the medieval village, a library with no walls and no books, held entirely in living heads and passed on entirely by living voices, kept safe by rhyme and rhythm and story from the forgetting that swallows so much. It was fragile in one way, for it could be lost in a single generation if the chain of telling were ever broken. And yet it was tough in another, tougher perhaps than parchment, for it could not burn, and it could not be locked away, and it copied itself freely into every child within earshot without any scribe ever lifting a pen. The plant knowledge that kept a people safe was, first and last, a spoken thing. Let us turn now to another way that this knowledge was made easy to hold in the mind, the old and gentle habit of reading a plant's own shape as a clue to what it was good for. There was an idea, very old and very widespread, that the plants of the world carried upon themselves small signs of their purpose, marks set there, as the devout believed, by a kindly providence, so that people might more easily find the remedies meant for them. A plant good for some part of the body would somehow resemble that part, in its leaf, or its flower, or its root. And a person who learned to read these resemblances would hold the key to the whole green pharmacy. The old writers gave this idea its fullest and most careful voice in the centuries around the close of the Middle Ages, and one English writer of a slightly later age set it down plainly, that the mercy of heaven had marked each herb with the very likeness of the ill it was made to cure. But the habit of reading a plant's look for a hint of its use was far older than any book that named the idea, and ran quietly through the whole of folk medicine. The examples were many, and once heard they are not easily forgotten, which was very much the point. The walnut, it was said, with its wrinkled kernel folded within a hard round shell, resembled nothing so much as the brain within the skull, and was therefore held good for the head and the mind. The plant called lungwort, whose broad leaves were spotted and mottled in a way that put people in mind of a diseased lung, was given for coughs and troubles of the chest. Eyebright, a small flower marked with a bright spot at its center like a little eye, was used to bathe sore and tired eyes. The liverworts, low and lobed and shaped somewhat like the liver itself, were turned to for that organ's complaints, and a plant whose knotted roots or swellings recalled the swollen glands of a certain sickness was reached for against that very sickness. Its very deformity read as a promise of cure. The list of such readings ran on and on, once a person began to look for them. A plant whose broken root or sap ran red, like the one the old people called bloodwort, was thought good for the blood and for the staunching of wounds. The bright yellow flowers and yellow sap of certain plants marked them. To this way of thinking, as remedies for the yellow sickness, we now call jaundice. A small plant that rooted in the very cracks of the rock and seemed to split the stone was named stone breaker, and given for the stone that formed and pained within the body. A flower shaped like a heart was held good for the heart, a leaf notched like a tooth for the toothache, a curved and cradling flower for the troubles of childbirth. Each pairing tied a use to a shape, and each shape, once truly seen, made its use a little harder ever after to forget. This way of reading the plants was neither new nor peculiar to one land. Something very like it can be found in the old learning of many peoples, and in the medieval world it drew upon ideas, reaching back to the ancient physicians, so that a habit already old was handed on, deepened, and given the warmth of a Christian meaning. The marks upon the plants read now as the very fingerprints of a caring providence. That so many different ages and places arrived at some version of the same idea tells us how naturally the human mind reaches for a likeness to hold a fact by. We are pattern-finding creatures, forever seeing a face in the moon or a shape in the embers of a fire, and the reading of a plant's form for a hint of its use was that same deep habit turned to a practical and gentle purpose. Now, we must be honest about this idea, and honesty here only deepens the interest of it. As a science of medicine, it was not reliable. A great many of these resemblances were fanciful, seen by an eye that wished to see them, and the cure did not always follow the sign. A plant that looked like a heart did not always help the heart, and a plant that looked like nothing in particular might be the finest medicine in the hedge. If the villagers of medieval Europe had trusted their lives to the doctrine of signatures alone, they would have fared very poorly indeed. It was not, in truth, how the safe and tested remedies had actually been discovered, for those had been found the long, hard way, by generations of patient trial, of noticing what helped and what did not, of watching and remembering across lifetimes. What the reading of signatures did well, and did beautifully, was something quite different from discovery. It made the knowledge easy to remember. Picture the sheer size of the thing that had to be held in a healer's memory. Hundreds of plants, each with its own several uses, its own preparation, its own cautions, all of it unwritten. Any trick that helped fasten a use to a plant in the mind was worth a great deal, and the resemblance of a plant to the part it treated was exactly such a trick. Tie the walnut to the head by its very shape, and you need never look the pairing up, for the plant itself reminds you every time you see it. The signature was a peg to hang the memory on, a picture that carried a fact, and in a world without written notes, such pegs were precious beyond price. Seen this way, the doctrine of signatures belongs beside the rhymes and the stories we spoke of a moment ago, as one more device by which a non-writing people kept an enormous body of knowledge alive and ready in the mind. It was not their science, it was their filing system, and a filing system does not need to be true in every particular to be useful, so long as it helps the right knowledge come to hand at the right moment. A healer might well have known perfectly, from long experience, that a certain spotted leaf eased a certain cough, and used the leaf's resemblance to the lung not as the reason for the cure, but simply as the string tied round the finger that helped her remember it. There was, besides its usefulness to the memory, a deep comfort in this way of seeing the green world, and the comfort should not be passed over, for it was much of the idea's quiet power. To believe that the plants had been marked with signs of their purpose was to believe that the world was legible, that a caring hand had written help into the very leaves, and left it there to be found, that nothing had been made without a use and a meaning for those who lived among it, for people whose lives were hard and whose remedies were often all that stood between them and loss. This was no small thing. It made the hedgerow not a random tangle, but a book of mercy, and every plant in it a word set down for their sake. Whether or not the signs were true, the faith that the world meant them kindness was itself a kind of medicine. It is worth noticing, too, where this habit of reading the plant did not reach, for the boundary tells us something. The signatures spoke almost entirely of cures, of what a plant was good for, and almost never of danger, of what a plant would do you harm. There was no signature of poison. The deadly nightshade wore no mark upon its shining berries to say that they would stop a heart. The hemlock carried no sign that a reader of resemblances could have used to know it for a killer. The knowledge that kept people safe, the negative knowledge of what to avoid, could not be read off a plant's shape at all. It had to be learned the other way, by name and by warning, and by the firm no of a watchful mother, exactly as we heard earlier tonight. The signatures helped a healer remember her remedies. They did nothing to keep a child from the poison berry. Those were two different bodies of knowledge, learned in two different ways, and it was the second, the plain hard learning of the dangers, that did the quiet work of keeping a people alive. And so we find, in this gentle old idea of the marked and legible plant, both a real usefulness and a real limit, held together without contradiction, the way so much of this old knowledge was. It helped the mind to hold what the hand had already learned. It made a vast pharmacy memorable, and it left the harder, plainer, life-saving lessons to be carried by other means entirely. Let us turn now to those other means once more, and to the names themselves, the words the plants were called by, and how those names worked as a field guide that every villager carried always upon the tongue. We have spoken of rhymes that carried knowledge, and of shapes that helped the mind to hold it. Let us turn now to something simpler still, and in its way the most powerful of all the memory tools these people had, the plain names of the plants themselves. For in the old country speech, a plant's name was very rarely just a label. It was a small parcel of information, folded tight, that told you at once, if you knew how to unfold it, what the plant was for, or where it grew, or what harm it might do. To learn the name was very often to learn the plant. The whole field guide, in a sense, was carried on the tongue. In the words a person had known since before they could remember learning them. Consider first the great host of names that told you plainly what a plant was good for. There was woundwort, which was used upon wounds. There was self-heal, and its cousin all-heal, reached for to close and mend. There was fever-few, given against fevers, and eyebright, used to bathe the eyes, and lungwort for the chest, and liverwort for the liver, and throatwort for the throat, and birthwort, which the midwives used, and toothwort, and sneezewort, and boneset, and the plant called knitbone, that we met earlier under its other name of comfrey, so called because it was believed to knit a broken bone. A person hearing any one of these names for the first time already knew half of what the plant was for, because the use was sitting right there inside the word. The name was the lesson. Many of these names ended in that small old syllable, wort, which meant simply a plant, or a root, or a useful herb, and which was joined, again and again, to the very trouble the plant was meant to answer. Stitchwort for the sharp stitch in the side. Pilewort for that particular discomfort. Scabwort and fleawort and lousewort, each named for the small plague it was thought to drive away. Spleenwort for the spleen, and figwort for a swelling the old people called the fig. To walk through the plant names of the old tongue is to walk through a catalogue of every ill that troubled a medieval body, each one paired with its green answer, the whole of it held together by that one small binding word. A child learning to speak learned this catalogue without ever knowing it was one. Alongside the names of use ran the names of warning, and these did their work just as plainly. We have heard some of them already. Deadly nightshade, which needs no explaining. Dead men's bells, for the foxglove. Devil's berries, and poison parsley, and bad man's oatmeal for the hemlock, and naked ladies for the crocus that killed. A name like this was a warning label written into the common speech, learned in childhood, impossible to forget, carried always, where a plant's very name told a child that it dealt in death or the devil, No further teaching was strictly needed. The word did the guarding, and because the word was spoken and shared and known to all, the warning reached every person in the parish, the learned and the simple alike, without a page ever being turned. Other names told you not what a plant did, but where it lived, which was a kind of knowledge every bit as useful, for knowing where a plant grew was half of knowing what it was. Marshmallow told you to look in the marsh. Watermint and brooklime and water dropwort all named the wet places they favored. Wood anemone and wood sorrel and woodruff belonged to the shade of the trees. Meadowsweet frothed in the damp meadow, and wall pennywort clung to the old stone wall, and stonecrop rooted in the dry rock. A gatherer who knew these names knew, before ever setting out, in what corner of the countryside each plant was to be sought, and, just as importantly, was warned when a plant turned up somewhere it had no business being, which was often the first small sign that the eye had made a mistake. There was a difficulty in all of this, and honesty requires that we name it, for it is part of why the local knowledge mattered so much. The country names were not fixed and orderly. One plant might carry a dozen different names in a dozen different regions, and, more troublesome still, a single name might be given to quite different plants in different places. The herb one village called by a certain name might be a healing thing, while the plant of that very same name, 3 valleys over, was something else entirely. This tangle of names was a real problem, and it was one reason the learned physicians clung to their Latin, an unchanging tongue in which a plant had one name only, so that a remedy written in one land could be read without confusion in another. For the villager, the answer was simpler and surer. Trust the plant, not merely its name. Know the thing itself in your own place, by sight and smell and touch, and let the name be only the handle by which you carried the knowledge, not the knowledge itself. For all its tangles, the naming carried an astonishing amount of learning, and carried it for free, always to hand, needing no book and no teacher and no candle to read it by. This was a field guide that cost nothing and could never be lost or left behind, for it lived in the same speech a person used for everything else. A woman who knew 300 plant names knew, folded into those names, 300 small stores of information about use and place and danger, and could call any of them up in an instant simply by speaking. No physician with his shelf of costly manuscripts had a reference so quick, so portable, or so completely his own. The plants were woven so deeply into the common tongue that they spilled over into the naming of everything else. Places took their names from the plants that grew there, so that a person could sometimes guess the herbs of a district from the names of its fields and villages alone. Children were given plant names and families, and the plants crept into 1,000 turns of everyday speech, into blessings and curses, and the small sayings of the hearth. To live in that world was to live inside a language half made of plants, in which the green world and the spoken world were laced together so tightly that a person could hardly think of the one without the other. A great many names carried the marks of faith as well, folding the church into the hedgerow. There was Herb Robert and Herb Bennet, this last named for a saint and worn as a guard against poison and against evil. There were the many plants given to Our Lady, Lady's mantle with its soft cloak of pleated leaves, Lady's bedstraw said to have lined the manger at Bethlehem, ladies' smock pale in the wet spring meadow. And there was St. John's wort, gathered at midsummer and hung above the door. To name a plant for a saint or for the Virgin was to wrap it in a familiar protection, and to make its name, once more, a thing that could not easily be forgotten. Tied as it now was to the whole round of the holy year that every soul in the parish already carried in the mind. Some names reached toward a plant's use by way of the animals, and here the naming brushed once more against that habit of reading a plant's shape that we spoke of a little earlier. The plant called Viper's buglos, whose small seeds were thought to resemble a snake's head, was held good against the bite of the adder. Adder's tongue and snakeweed, and the various herbs that took the names of creatures, coltsfoot and hound's tongue and crowfoot, and the cuckoo pint we have already met, wove the beasts of the countryside into the green world so thoroughly that a child learned the plants and the animals together in a single tangled speech, where a flower might be named for a bird's foot and a leaf for a serpent's tongue. It was only much later, long after the close of the medieval age, that scholars grew weary of the endless tangle of country names and set about giving every plant a single fixed name that would hold good everywhere. That great tidying, when it came, brought a real clarity. And we are the heirs of it still, for we can now name a plant in a way that a person on the far side of the world will understand exactly. But something was quietly lost in the tidying too. The old country names, for all their confusion, had carried the use and the place and the danger of a plant right there in the word. The new names, precise and orderly, carried none of that. They told you what a plant was called, and nothing more. The lesson had been taken out of the name and set down in books instead. And the villager, who once carried a whole field guide upon the tongue, was, by slow degrees, left to look things up. But in the centuries we are speaking of, the lesson was still in the name. And this was one more thread in the strong, quiet net that kept a people safe among their plants. The child who learned to say deadly nightshade learned to fear it in the same breath. The woman who spoke of woundwort reached for it, without thinking, when a wound needed dressing. The names were a map and a warning and a memory all at once, spoken 1,000 times a day, learned before reason and kept until death, so common and so constant that no one ever thought to call it knowledge at all. It was simply the way things were spoken of, and the speaking itself kept everyone safe. Let us turn now from the names of the plants to the places where the plants were learned, and above all to that long green university with no walls or fees, the hedgerow, and the slow patient teaching that went on there in every season of the year. If the household was the first school of plant knowledge, the hedgerow and the field and the wood were the second and the greater, and the child who had learned the first firm nose at the mother's knee went out, as the years passed, to learn the rest of it walking. For the deepest plant knowledge could not be taught indoors, from words alone. It had to be walked into, season by season, plant by plant, in the very places the plants grew, until the whole living landscape had been read so many times that its every green sentence was known by heart. This walking school never closed, and a person went on learning in it from earliest childhood to the very edge of old age. The gathering expedition was its chief lesson, and gathering was a thing medieval people did constantly. For the pot, for the byre, for the medicine shelf, for the dye vat, for 100 small needs. A woman going out to gather rarely went alone, and rarely without a child or two trailing behind her. And the walk was a lesson from the first step to the last. This plant here, growing where the ground stays wet, we take for such a purpose. That one on the dry bank where the sun strikes, we leave until later in the year. This we gather now in the bud. That we wait for until the seed is set. The lesson was given in the doing, hand and eye together, and it sank far deeper than any lesson given in words alone ever could. The seasons set the whole curriculum, and each turning of the year brought its own things to be learned and gathered. Spring taught the young leaves and the first shoots, and the great rule of the wild garlic and its dangerous doubles that we heard of earlier, for spring was the season of that particular test. Early summer taught the flowers, gathered at their opening and dried for the year. High summer taught the leaf and the stem at their fullest strength. Autumn taught the fruits and the roots, the berries that must be told from their poison neighbors, the roots dug as the plant's strength drew downward. A child who had walked the whole round of a single year had been shown the entire green calendar once. A woman who had walked it 50 times knew it as she knew her own hands. There were rules to the gathering, and the beauty of these rules is that they served two purposes at once, guarding the gatherer and guarding the land together. Never take the first plant you find, went one old rule, and never take the last, so that the patch might seed itself again and something be left for whoever or whatever came after. Take only what you can name and trace to its own root and leaf. Went another, which was the great safety rule we have already met, keeping the unknown plant forever out of the basket. Ask the plant's leave before you cut it. Went a third, a small courtesy that slowed the hand and turned each gathering into a considered act, rather than a careless snatch. These rules were taught to a child alongside the plants themselves, and a child who kept them was kept safe by them, quite as much as the hedgerow was. The very ground was itself a teacher, for where a plant grew told a great deal about what it was, and a keen eye learned to read the landscape as a guide to the green things in it. Hemlock and its deadly watery cousins kept to the wet ditch and the marshy margin, and so a white-flowered plant standing in the dry meadow was, by its very place, less likely to be one of them. Foxglove favored the acid bank and the woodland clearing. The good potherbs clustered where people had long lived, about the old walls and the tumbled cottage sites, sown there by generations of hands. To know the ground was to know, before ever crushing a leaf, what a plant was likely to be, and this reading of place was one of the surest guides of all, learned only by walking the same country over and over until its every corner had been understood. Much of this walking was done upon the common land, that shared ground where the people of a parish had the ancient right to graze a beast, cut fuel, and gather what grew wild, and the common was a great open classroom where the knowledge of a whole village met and mingled. Here the poorest cottager, with no garden to speak of, could still gather the greens and the simples that kept a family fed and physicked, and here a child could watch not only a mother, but a dozen neighbors at their gathering, and pick up a little from each. The knowledge of the commons was truly common, shared property of all who worked it, and richer for the sharing. Among the humblest of these shared gatherings was the gleaning, the ancient right of the poor to follow the harvesters across the shorn field and pick up what the reapers had let fall. Gleaning was hedged about with its own careful customs, begun only when a last sheaf was set at the field's edge to signal the field was open, ended at dusk, shared out by rules that everyone understood. For the poorest families it was no small thing, the difference between want and enough through the coming winter, and it was, besides its bread, one more walking lesson. The children stooping beside their mothers over the stubble, learning the grains and the field weeds among them, the good seed and the bad, and the darkened, ergot-bitten ear that must be gathered out and cast aside, of which we shall hear more later in our evening. The tools of gathering were themselves part of the teaching and part of the safety. The basket kept ready by the door, the clean cloth for the wrapping, the small blade reserved for cutting herbs, and kept apart from the knife of the table. All of these a child learned to handle properly, and in the handling learned the seriousness of the work. It was said in many places that the herb knife should be kept clean and bright, and used for nothing else. And whatever old belief lay behind the custom, there was a plain good sense in it too, for a blade kept for the herbs alone carried nothing from the kitchen or the buyer into the gathered medicine. The care of the tools taught the care of the whole craft. Learning in this walking school was learning by watching and by doing, corrected gently in the moment, over and over, until the doing became sure. A child brought the wrong leaf and was shown the right one, there and then, with the plant itself in hand. A child tugged at a root the wrong way and was shown how to lift it whole. A child reached toward the forbidden berry and had the hand turned aside and the old warning repeated once more. Nothing was abstract. Everything was the plant itself, in its own place, in the season it grew, handled and smelled and looked at until it was known past forgetting. This is why the knowledge held so firm. It was not learned from a description, but from the living thing, and knowledge learned that way sinks into the body and stays. When the collectors of old customs went out, many centuries later, to write down what still lived in the memory of the oldest country people, they often lingered longest over these gathering walks, describing them almost with longing. They wrote of following an old woman along a lane at first light as she named every plant they passed without once pausing, of the quiet companionable silence of a gathering, of children who could tell a score of herbs before ever they could write their own names. There is a wistfulness in these records, a sense of watching the last of something very old and very deep pass quietly out of the world, a whole way of knowing the land that had lasted 1,000 years and was, even as they wrote it down, slipping gently beyond recall. The years of this walking built, in the end, that deep bodily knowing that so struck the few outsiders who ever remarked upon it. The country woman whose hands sorted the safe from the deadly faster than her mind could follow, who could name a plant in the dusk by its smell, who knew a hedgerow so completely that a single plant out of its right place caught her eye at once. This was not a gift, and it was not genius. It was the plain fruit of a lifetime of walking the same green country, taught by the land itself, in a school that charged no fee and gave no certificate, and turned out, generation upon generation, a whole people fluent in the plants they lived among. Let us turn now from the open hedgerow to the low door of the cottage, and to the quiet, watchful rules of the kitchen. where the last decision about what a family would eat was made. We have followed the knowledge from the child's earliest lessons out into the hedgerow and back again. Let us turn now to the place where the whole of it came to a point, where all the learning of names and shapes and dangers finally had to answer one plain question: shall this go into the pot or shall it not? That place was the kitchen, and the keeper of it was the goodwife, and her quiet, constant watchfulness over what her family ate was one of the strongest guardrails of all. The goodwife held an authority in the kitchen that was rarely written into any law, but was understood by everyone, and it was, above all else, an authority over the pot. Whatever was gathered, whatever was brought in from the field, or bought at the market, or dug from the garden, passed through her hands and her judgment before it fed the household. She was the last gate, and she knew it, and she guarded the gate with a care that came from bearing the whole weight of her family's health upon her shoulders. A husband might plough, and a child might gather, but it was she who decided what became food, and this single, settled point of decision, one careful person answering for the whole table, was itself a great safety. Her first and firmest rule was the rule of the known. Into the pot went only the things she knew, truly and certainly by long acquaintance. A leaf she could not name did not go in, however green and wholesome it looked, however confidently a child had brought it. This was the same great rule we met out in the hedgerow: never eat what you cannot name, brought indoors and set as the standing law of the kitchen. It sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet it caught nearly everything. For the accidents that befell people almost always came of eating the strange and the doubtful, and the goodwife's flat refusal to admit the strange and the doubtful shut that door before it could ever open. She tasted as she cooked, and the tasting was a gate as well as a pleasure. A cook who tasted her pottage as it simmered was doing more than judging the salt. She was letting her tongue, that old and faithful guardian, pass its own judgment, for the tongue recoils at the bitter and the acrid and the wrong long before the stomach is troubled, and a great many dangerous plants betray themselves by a bitterness no cook would willingly leave in a dish. To taste a little, and taste early, and trust the recoil of the tongue, was a habit so deep that no one thought of it as a safeguard at all, and yet a safeguard it plainly was. Cooking itself did quiet protective work, and the goodwife knew, without knowing the reasons a later age would give, that some things were safe cooked which were not safe raw. The nettle, fierce with sting in the hedge, lost all its fire the moment it met the boiling pot, and became a mild and strengthening green. The elderberry, which could trouble a stomach if eaten straight from the bush, was always cooked into its syrups and cordials, and never taken raw. Certain beans and roots asked for long boiling before they were fit, and the goodwife gave it to them. The medieval pottage, that endless simmering pot at the heart of the cottage, boiled long and slow for hours, and in the long boiling lay a protection the cook felt no need to explain. It was simply how a thing was done, and the doing kept people well. There was another face to the goodwife's kitchen craft, gentler than the guarding, but drawn from the very same deep knowledge, and that was the turning of food into medicine when someone in the house fell ill. For the sick she made the warming caudle and the soft posset, thin broths thickened with egg or ale, and touched with the herbs she judged the sufferer needed, A little of this to settle the stomach, a little of that to bring on a healing sweat. This was cookery and physic at once, and it asked for the finest judgment of all. For the sick were the frailest of the household, and the same herb that eased a strong body might overtax a weak one, that she could feed the whole household in health and physic it in sickness, both out of the same small store and the same trained knowing, shows how complete a plant knowledge an ordinary woman quietly carried. Beyond the cooking lay the keeping, and here too the goodwife's order guarded her family. The dangerous plants of the medicine shelf, the henbane and the poppy, and the other strong simples that were medicine in a small dose and harm in a large one, were kept apart from the food, set high on a shelf or in a locked box, out of the reach of a curious child and well away from the herbs of the pot. She did not store the sleeping herb beside the cooking herb, where a tired hand might one night confuse them. The very arrangement of her stores, the safe things low and to hand, the strong things high and apart, was a kind of silent map of danger, laid out so that no accident could easily happen even in the dark or in haste. The children and the beasts were watched with the same steady care within the home as without it. If monkshood grew for its beauty in the garden, the smallest child was kept from that corner and taught, as soon as it could understand, that the pretty blue flowers were not to be touched. The dog and the pig and the fowl, which would eat what they should not if left to themselves, were kept from the plants that would sicken them. The goodwife's eye moved constantly over her small kingdom, marking where the dangers lay and who might blunder into them, heading off the accident before it came. Much of the safety of that world was made of exactly this, a watchful eye that never quite rested. The bread deserves its own word, for bread was the very staff of life, and the grain that made it passed through several careful hands before it reached the loaf. The goodwife, or the miller, or both, looked over the grain, and a good housewife knew to pick out and cast away any ear that had gone dark and swollen and wrong, the blighted grain that we shall come to later when we speak of the rare occasions when things went amiss. In the ordinary way, this picking over of the grain was one more quiet gate, one more place where a knowing eye stood between a family and harm, so habitual that it was done half without thought, and yet real for all that. Even the owl and the water came under her judgment. Owl was brewed in nearly every house and was safer in that world than much of the water, and the goodwife brewed it and tasted it, and knew when a batch had gone sour or strange. The water she drew she knew the source of, the clean spring or the good well, and she kept her family from the standing pool and the fouled ditch as she kept them from the poison berry, by knowledge and by habit. The whole business of feeding a household safely was hers, an unbroken daily vigilance made of 100 small judgments, each one small enough to seem like nothing, all of them together strong enough to keep a family whole. Much of her knowledge showed itself in the keeping of the winter stores, for a family had to eat through the long cold months when little grew, and the wrong thing stored, or the right thing stored wrongly, could spoil and sicken. She dried her herbs in the airy loft and knew when they were ready and when they had taken damp and must be thrown out. She salted and she smoked. She made her cordials and her preserves, and she watched her stores all through the winter, for the first sign of mood or of rot, casting out the spoiled before it could taint the rest. To lay in a store that would feed a family safely from harvest to spring was a yearly feat of exactly this quiet, practical knowledge, reckoned so ordinary that no one thought to praise it. Though a family's life through a hard winter might hang upon it, it is worth dwelling for a moment on how much rested upon her and how quietly she bore it. She was not thought of, in her own time, as a physician or an expert or a keeper of anyone's safety. She was thought of as a wife keeping her house, doing the plain daily work that wives had always done. And yet in that plain work, she carried a knowledge of plants and foods, and their dangers deep enough to keep a family fed, and well through every season of a hard world, deciding, day after day, meal after meal, where the line ran between food and harm, and setting it, nearly always, in exactly the right place. There was a firmness in her that the danger of her world required, and the old sayings caught it. A doubtful thing was met not with curiosity, but with a plain refusal. Out it went, and no more said. Where a modern cook might be tempted to try the unfamiliar green, to see what it was like, the goodwife of that world had the harder wisdom of the flat no, learned from a lifetime lived close to real consequence. She could not afford experiment, and she did not make it, and her family lived the longer for her caution. It was a caution taught to her, in turn, by her own mother, in the same kitchen, over the same pot, and passed on again to the daughters who watched her cook. And so the kitchen was the last link in a long chain of care that ran from the mother's first no, through the walking lessons of the hedgerow, through the names and the rhymes and all the rest, and ended here, at the pot, in the steady judgment of a woman deciding what her family would eat. Every other safeguard we have spoken of led, in the end, to this one, the moment when a knowing hand chose the food, and chose it well. The knowledge that kept a people safe was, at the very last, exercised 3 times a day, quietly, by the women bending over the cooking fires of 10,000 villages. Let us turn now beyond the cottage door and the garden gate, out to the noise and colour of the market, where things came in from far away, from hands the buyer would never know, and where a whole different set of guardians stood watch. Within the parish, safety rested on knowledge, on knowing the plant, and the ground and the person. But the market brought in what the parish could not grow or make, spices from far lands, drugs and simples from distant apothecaries, dyes and roots that had passed through many hands before reaching the stall. Here the old safety of personal knowledge could not fully reach, for how was a cottager to know whether the costly powder, sold as one thing, was truly that thing, or something cheaper, or something worse? And so, around the market, there grew up a different kind of guardian, not the knowledge of the individual, but the watchfulness of the community, made into rules and offices and courts. The medieval market was one of the most closely governed things in the whole of that world, hedged about with regulations that strike us now as remarkably careful. There were fixed places and fixed times for selling, so that trade happened in the open, under many eyes, where a cheat could be seen. There were rules against buying up goods before they reached the market to sell them dearer, against cornering a scarce commodity, against the many small frauds by which a seller might rob a buyer. And there were officers whose whole task was to see these rules kept, to weigh and to measure and to test, and to catch out the dishonest before their dishonesty could do harm. At the great fairs there sat a court so quick and so particular to the marketplace that it took its name from the dusty feet of the travelling traders who came before it, the court of the dusty feet, which dealt out justice on the very day a wrong was done, while the wronged and the wrongdoer were both still at the fair. A trader who sold false or dangerous goods might find himself judged before the day was out, his goods condemned, his person punished, and the whole matter settled before he could pack his cart and move on to cheat another town. This swiftness was the point of it. A travelling seller counted on being gone before his frauds were found. The court of the dusty feet took that comfort from him. The quality of the most basic goods was set by law and watched by officers appointed for the purpose. The weight and worth of bread and all were fixed by an older size, and the baker who sold a light or bad loaf and the brewer who sold a poor or watered ale answered for it. The baker caught cheating might be set in the pillory, with his own bad loaf hung about his neck for all to see, a punishment aimed as much at his good name as at his comfort. For in a world of settled communities and long memories, a ruined name was a ruined trade. The very measures of the market were watched as closely as the goods, the weights and the yardsticks, the bushel and the pint, for a false measure was a slow and constant fraud that robbed every buyer a little. Standard measures were kept, often at the market cross or in the town hall, against which a doubtful weight could be checked, and the officers went among the stalls testing them. A trader found with a false weight might have it broken openly before the crowd, and pay a fine besides. In many places the market opened only at the ringing of a bell and closed at its ringing again, so that all buying and selling fell within the same watched hours, and the early private bargain, struck in a quiet corner before the honest crowd arrived, was itself an offence with a name and a punishment, the drugs and spices, being costly and easily counterfeited, drew a particular watchfulness. In London there was an office whose holder was charged with searching and cleaning the spices and drugs that came into the city, sorting the good from the false and the foul, casting out what was adulterated or spoiled before it could be sold. The old word for this cleaning gave the officer his title, and his work stood between the buyer and a whole world of costly frauds. The pepper bulked out with sweepings, the saffron mixed with meaner stuff, the drug that was not what it claimed. The guilds of the grocers, and later of the apothecaries, took this duty upon themselves in part, for their own good name depended on the honesty of their trade, and a member caught selling false wares shamed them all. The apothecaries, who dealt in the strongest and most dangerous wares of all, came in time under a particular watch, for a bad drug was reckoned a far graver thing than a bad loaf. Their guilds bound them by oath and by ordinance to keep their drugs fresh and true, to throw out what had grown old and lost its virtue, and to compound their medicines honestly by the tested receipts. In some cities the physicians themselves were given the right to enter the apothecaries' shops and search their stores, casting out into the street whatever they found stale or false or wrongly made. A trade that dealt in things that could kill was held, quite rightly, to a stricter account than the trades that dealt only in things that could feed. Some towns guarded their trade with a sternness that shows how seriously the danger of adulteration was taken. In one great trading city of the German lands, the saffron that was so precious and so easily faked, was watched by sworn inspectors, and the old records claim that those who were caught mixing it with cheaper stuff, or with anything that might harm the buyer, could be punished with a harshness that leaves no doubt how gravely the offense was viewed, for saffron went into medicine as well as food, and a poisoned or worthless drug sold as a healing one was reckoned very near to murder. Whether or not every tale of such punishments is exactly true, the fear of them kept many a hand honest. Beneath all these offices and courts ran the quiet, constant force of reputation, which in a small and settled world was perhaps the strongest guardian of all. The woman who sold bunches of herbs at the weekly market was known to her buyers and would be there again next week and the week after for years. She could not vanish like a traveling cheat. Her trade depended wholly on the trust of neighbors who would remember, and remember long, if ever her wares did harm. This was a powerful discipline, gentler than any court and more constant, and it meant that the ordinary sellers of the ordinary market, the herb women and the root sellers, and the keepers of the small stalls, had every reason in the world to sell only what was good and true. The buyers, for their part, did not come to market helpless or trusting blindly. A woman buying a costly drug or an unfamiliar spice might bring along, or ask after, someone who knew the thing, and the market was full of quiet expertise freely shared, one buyer warning another that a certain stall's wares were poor, a knowing neighbor testing a powder between finger and thumb, or holding it up against the light. The same web of shared knowledge that guarded the hedgerow reached into the market too, so that even here, among far-brought and unfamiliar goods, the ordinary person was rarely quite alone with the decision, but stood within a crowd that watched and remembered and told one another what was good and what was not. So the buyer at the market, who could not always know for himself whether a far-brought thing was what it seemed, was guarded instead by this whole web of watchfulness, the fixed times and places, the weighing officers, the swift courts, the searching of the spices, the guilds jealous of their name, and above and beneath it all the long memory of a community that did not forget a cheat. It was a different safety from the knowledge of the hedgerow, a safety made of many people watching, rather than one person knowing. But it did the same work, standing between the ordinary person and the things that might do them harm, and doing it, most of the time, remarkably well. Let us turn now to those who kept the most dangerous plants of all, not to avoid them but to use them, and to the careful art by which a poison became a medicine in a knowing hand. So far we have spoken almost entirely of avoidance, of the great and careful work of keeping the dangerous plants out of the mouth and out of the pot. But there is another half to this story, quieter and in some ways more remarkable still, and it is this. The most dangerous plants of all were not only avoided, they were also used. In the right hands, in the right amount, the very plants that could kill were among the most valued medicines a village had, and the people who kept and used them held a knowledge finer and more perilous than any we have yet described. Let us turn now to them, to the wise woman and the cunning man, and to the careful art by which a poison became a cure. At the heart of that art lay a single truth, so simple to say, and so hard to master that whole libraries of later medicine would be written around it. It is the amount that makes the poison. The same plant, in a small enough measure, might heal what in a larger measure it would harm, and the whole difference between a medicine and a poison lay not in the plant at all, but in the dose. A much later writer would set this down as a plain rule, that all things are poison, and nothing is without poison, and only the dose decides. But the wise women who dealt in henbane and poppy and foxglove had known the thing itself in their hands and their practice, long before any scholar found the words for it. It was the very ground they stood on. Consider the poppy, that bright and innocent flower of the cornfield, whose seed fed the bread, and whose dried juice was the strongest easer of pain the medieval world possessed. In a careful dose it brought blessed sleep to the sleepless, quiet to the racked, and a merciful dimming of the worst agonies of illness and injury. In too great a dose it brought a sleep from which there was no waking. The healer who used it walked a narrow path between those two, and walked it by knowledge alone, by knowing her own preparation, its strength, its proper measure, and the frailty or the strength of the one she gave it to. This was not reckless. It was the very opposite of reckless. It was among the most careful acts a human being could perform. The henbane we met earlier, with its heavy warning smell, was another such plant, kept by the knowing for its power to bring sleep and to still pain and the shaking of certain sicknesses. Monkshood, so deadly by mouth, was used upon the outside of the body, rubbed as a liniment upon an aching joint, where its power to numb could be borrowed without its power to kill being invited in. Each of these plants sat in the wise woman's store like a sharp tool in a careful workman's hand, dangerous certainly, but dangerous in the way a good blade is dangerous, its danger the very source of its usefulness, held in check by skill. The deadly nightshade, that beautiful lady of the shining blackberries, had its careful uses too, its juice let fall into the eye to widen and darken it, whether for the physician's honest purpose, or the vanity that gave the plant its softer name. Here again was a poison turned, by knowledge and by the smallest of measures, to a use, and here again the whole safety of it lay in knowing exactly how little to give and exactly how much was too much. To handle such a plant at all was to live by that knowledge, and those who kept it precisely because they had it. There survives, from the surgery of the medieval monasteries, an account of one of the most striking uses of these dangerous plants, the sleeping sponge that was used to dull the pain of the knife. A sponge was steeped in the juices of several of the strong soporific plants together, the poppy and the henbane and others of that fearful company, and dried, and then, when a surgery was to be done, moistened and held for the patient to breathe, that they might sink into a deep sleep and be spared the worst of what was to come. To make such a thing, and to use it without killing the sleeper, required a knowledge of these poisons so exact that it takes the breath a little even now to consider it, a knowledge held and passed down within the quiet infirmaries of the religious houses across the centuries. The same deep knowledge of the poisons gave rise to their very opposite, the making of antidotes and counter-poisons, in which the age placed great faith. The most famous of these was an ancient compound of many ingredients, Trickle as the Old English tongue came in time to call it, reckoned a guard against poisons and venoms of every kind. It was made by careful hands to old and tested receipts, and in some cities its making was watched, and its quality sworn to, so precious was it held. Whether it worked as fully as its great reputation claimed, we may leave gently aside. But the very existence of such prized antidotes shows how seriously the danger of poison was taken, and how much thought was given, not only to avoiding harm, but to the undoing of it once it was done. How was such precise measuring done? In a world with no fine scales and no standard strengths, where one crop of a plant might be stronger than the next. It was done by intimate knowledge of the particular, by a healer knowing her own herbs, gathered by her own hand at the right season from the ground she knew, dried in her own loft, and tested, gently and carefully, in use. She knew the strength of this batch, because she had made it. She began always with a little, and watched, and added only if she must, feeling her way toward the right measure, rather than trusting to any fixed rule. The knowledge was not written in numbers, but held in the hand and the eye, and the long memory of what had served before, and it was all the surer for being so particular and so personal. There was, besides the danger to the patient, a danger to the healer herself in keeping such plants, and this too shaped the great care with which they were handled. A woman known to keep the poisons was a woman who might, in a bad season, be looked at sidewise, blamed if a death came that no one could explain, suspected of the very powers her healing depended upon. The wise women knew this, and it made them careful in a second way, careful not only of the dose, but of the appearance of things, using the strong plants only for clear and honest need, keeping them close and quiet, never careless with a knowledge that could so easily be turned against the one who held it. Their caution was, in part, the caution of people who knew they walked a narrow line in more ways than one. The care they took shows most clearly, perhaps, in the story of one dangerous plant whose careful use was written down at last, long after the age we speak of, by a physician honest enough to say where his knowledge had come from. The foxglove, which we met in the hedge with its spire of purple thimbles and its name of dead men's bells, was known to the country wise women as a plant for a certain kind of failing, a dropsy, a swelling of the body when the heart grew weak and the waters gathered. A physician of a later century, hearing of an old country woman's recipe that eased this dreadful swelling when all his own learning had failed, set himself to find which plant in her mixture did the work, and found it was the foxglove, and spent long years learning the exact and careful dose at which it healed rather than harmed. He gave the plant its due in a careful book, and in doing so gave the due, though he could not have named her, to the whole long line of wise women who had known the foxglove's secret and its danger for centuries before him. That story holds within it the whole of what we are trying to understand tonight, the reason a people surrounded by poison so rarely came to grief. It was not that they kept away from the dangerous plants. Some of them went deliberately, knowingly, toward the most dangerous plants of all, and made them serve. The safety lay not in distance but in knowledge, in a knowledge so deep and so exact that even a killer could be handled and put to good use. The foxglove that could stop a heart could also steady one. And the only thing that stood between the two was what a person knew. There was a wisdom, too, in how this dangerous knowledge was shared out, for not everyone needed to hold it, and it was better that not everyone did. The ordinary goodwife did not keep monkshood and henbane in her kitchen. She kept the gentle herbs, the chamomile and the mint and the calendula, And when a trouble came that called for the strong plants, she sent for the one who kept them. This division of knowledge was itself a safety. The most dangerous plants were concentrated in the fewest and most expert hands, the people most careful of them and most practiced with them, while the ordinary household dealt only with the mild and the forgiving. The danger was not spread thin across everyone. It was gathered up and given to the few who could be trusted with it, and those few kept their dangerous stores with a care that matched the danger. The strong plants were dried and stored apart, marked in whatever way a woman who could not write chose to mark them, by the shape of the jar, the color of the thread, the corner of the shelf, so that no confusion could arise even in haste or in the dark. They were kept high and kept close, and kept from children with an absolute firmness. A wise woman's store was a small and orderly and deeply considered thing, every dangerous item known and placed and accounted for, because she above all people understood exactly what she was keeping. The knowledge of the strong plants was passed on, when it was passed on, only to the right hands, and only when those hands were ready. A wise woman did not teach the deadly doses to a heedless girl, or to one too young to grasp their weight. She taught first the gentle herbs, and only slowly, as trust and skill and steadiness grew, let her apprentice near the dangerous ones, so that the most perilous knowledge came last, and came only to those proven fit to carry it. This slow and careful handing on was one more guard, ensuring that the knowledge of the poisons stayed always in careful hands, never spilling out to the careless or the cruel. So the wise woman stands at the very center of our question tonight, the keeper of the sharpest edge of all this knowledge. Around her, the whole village practiced the safety of avoidance, knowing the dangerous plants in order to keep clear of them. She practiced the deeper and harder safety of use, knowing them in order to make them serve. And between the two, the many who avoided and the few who used, the danger of a green and poisonous world was held so well in check that the accidents were few, and the plants that could kill spent far more of their time healing than harming, in the careful hands of women whose knowledge we can now only admire from a long way off. Let us turn now to another set of teachers, older than any wise woman and wiser, in their way, than any book, the animals of the field and the wood, and all that the watching of them taught. Long before there were herbals, and quite apart from any human knowledge, the beasts of the countryside went about their grazing making every day, exactly the choices that people were so anxious to make rightly, taking this plant and refusing that one, and the country folk who lived among them watched and learned. There was an old and widespread belief that the animals knew, by an instinct people did not share, which plants were wholesome and which were harmful, and that a person might learn something worth knowing simply by marking what the beasts would eat and what they would leave. Like much old belief, it held both a real truth and a real limit, and the country people, in the main, understood both. The herdsmen and the shepherds were the great students of this animal wisdom, for their whole lives were spent watching beasts among plants, and they grew into botanists of a particular and practical kind. A shepherd who followed his flock across the same downs and pastures year upon year came to know every plant that grew there, which the sheep sought out and which they stepped around, which sweetened the milk and which sought it, which would sicken a beast that ate too much, and which would ease one that ailed. This was knowledge won by watching, season after season, the slow, quiet study of a man with long hours and sharp eyes, and it made the herdsman in his own domain as deep a knower of plants as any wise woman in hers. Much of what they learned was a knowledge of danger, for certain plants were as deadly to the beasts as to their keepers, and a herdsman had to know them or lose his charges. The yew, so poisonous to people, was death to cattle and horses too, and a herdsman kept his beasts from the churchyard tree, and from the fallen clippings of it with the greatest care, for the old records are full of whole herds lost to a single careless afternoon among the yew. Certain other plants would sicken or kill a grazing animal, and the herdsman knew them all, and knew too the strange fact that some plants a beast would sensibly refuse when growing fresh in the field became a hidden danger when dried and mixed into the winter hay, where the animal could no longer tell them apart. This was a knowledge of poison every bit as careful as the households, kept for the sake of the beasts. The pigs had their own place in this partnership, for in autumn they were turned loose into the woods to fatten on the fallen mast, the acorns and the beech nuts under the eye of the swineherd, and a pig will root and eat with a boldness that would undo a more delicate creature. Yet even the pig had its limits, and the swineherd knew them, knew which woods were good and which held dangers, knew when the acorns lay too thick for safety and when the beasts should be moved on. The goat, proverbial then, as now for eating very nearly anything, was watched with a wary respect, for its hardy stomach made it a poor guide indeed to what a person might safely swallow, and the old people knew better than to follow where a goat would go. The watching of animals as a guide to what people themselves might safely eat was real and useful, and also, as the wiser country folk knew, not to be trusted too far. For the plain truth was that the beasts did not share our dangers exactly. A bird would eat, with perfect ease, the bright berries of the yew, or the nightshade that would kill a child, its body untroubled by what would end a human life. A deer or a goat could browse on leaves that no person should touch. To watch the animals, then, was to gather a hint and not a rule, a place to begin looking rather than a verdict to be trusted, and the country wisdom held both halves of this together, using the animals' choices as one guide among many, while never forgetting that a beast's stomach and a person's were not the same. The knowledge ran the other way as well, from people to beasts, for the same plant law that healed the household was turned also to the healing of the animals on which the household depended. A sick cow, a lame horse, a flock troubled by some complaint, were treated with the herbs and the simples of the same green pharmacy, and much of the folk medicine of the countryside was as much for the byre and the fold as for the sick bed. The plants that eased a person's swelling eased a beast's, the wound herbs that dressed a man's cut dressed a horse's, and the herdsman and the goodwife between them held a knowledge that stretched across the whole living household, two-legged and four-legged alike. There was an old and gentle belief, too, that a sick beast would seek out for itself the very plant that would cure it, the dog that cropped the grass when its stomach was troubled, the deer that sought a certain herb when it was hurt, and that a watchful person might learn a remedy simply by marking what an ailing animal chose to eat. How much truth lay in this we may leave open, but it was widely held, and it added to the sense that the green world was full of remedies waiting to be found, and that the animals, closer to their instincts than people, sometimes found them first. Whether or not a hurt deer truly knew its own medicine, the belief kept the country people watching their beasts closely, and a person who watches closely learns a great deal, whatever the reason that first set them watching. The teaching of this animal wisdom, like all the rest, was done by the young following the old. The boys sent out with the herds learning from the old herdsman, as the girl in the garden learned from her mother. A child watching sheep learned the plants of the pasture in the doing, which the flock loved and which it shunned, where the good grazing lay, and where the dangerous corner that must be kept from. It was one more walking school, out on the open hill this time rather than in the hedgerow, and it turned out, generation upon generation, herdsmen who could read a pasture as surely as a scholar reads a page. The beasts served, too, as a kind of living almanac, their behavior read for signs of the weather and the season that bore so directly on the plants. The bees kept close to the hive before a coming storm. The cattle lay down against the rain, the swallows flew low, and the country people marked all of it, for knowing the weather was half of knowing when to gather and when to hold back. A shepherd who could read the sky and his flock together, and knew from both when the frost would come or the wet would set in, gathered his plants at the right hour and saved his stores from spoiling. And in this too the animals were quiet teachers to those who cared to watch them. There is a gentleness in this old partnership between the country people and their beasts, a sense of two kinds of creature grazing the same green world and learning quietly from one another. The people watched the animals to see what might be safe, and kept the animals from what they knew to be dangerous, and out of this long mutual watching came a shared safety in which fewer beasts and fewer people came to harm. It was not a perfect guide, this reading of the animals, and the country folk knew it was not, but it was one more thread in the net, one more source of the knowledge that kept a whole living community, human and animal together, walking safely among the poisons of a green and generous and dangerous world. Let us turn now to the turning of the year itself, and to the way the old calendar of saints and seasons wrapped the whole of this plant knowledge in a rhythm that kept it safe. We have spoken of the rhythm of the seasons more than once tonight, for the plants themselves keep that rhythm, and anyone who lives by them must keep it too. But there was another calendar laid over the plain turning of the year, and it wrapped the whole of this plant knowledge in a shape that made it easier to hold and safer to keep. That was the calendar of the church, the great round of feasts and saints' days and holy seasons by which every soul in medieval Europe measured out the year, and into which the gathering and using of plants was woven so completely that the two could hardly be told apart. For the medieval villager, time was not the blank and numbered thing it is for us. It was a rich and familiar procession of named days, each with its own meaning and its own customs, and a person thought of the year not in the cold count of dates, but in these warm and living landmarks. A thing was done at Candlemas, or after Lady Day, or about Michaelmas, or on the eve of a particular saint, and everyone knew when that was and what belonged to it. The plants took their places within this procession, each gathered at its own holy season, so that the calendar of the saints was also, quietly, a calendar of the herbs. The clearest example, and the best loved, was the eve of the summer solstice, tied by the church to the feast of Saint John, the shortest night of the year, and the one held richest in green power. It was said that herbs gathered on that one night carried a strength they held at no other time, and above all the plant that still bears the saint's name. The St. John's wort, with its little golden flowers, was gathered then and hung above the door and kept through the year. Whole villages went out into the fields on that bright eve, the fires lit on the hilltops, and the gathering that was on any other night the solitary work of a single woman became, for this one evening, a shared and almost joyful task. A child taken along on St. John's Eve learned, in a single memorable night, which herbs were most prized, and when they were to be taken. Other days carried their own plant customs, and many a folk belief that looks at first like mere superstition holds a plain caution within it. It was widely said that blackberries must not be gathered after a certain autumn feast, for after that day the devil had spoiled them. And whatever a person made of the old tale, the practical truth behind it was sound, for by that season the late berries had indeed begun to turn, softened by frost and damp, and no longer good to eat. The saint's day marked, in the language of the holy year, exactly the point past which the fruit was best left alone. Here again the calendar carried a piece of plain good sense, dressed in the clothes of custom, and a child who kept the custom ate no spoiled fruit. There is a quiet wisdom hidden inside this tying of plants to fixed days, and it is worth drawing out, for it bears directly on the safety we have been tracing all evening. To say that a certain herb must be gathered at midsummer, and not before or after, is to fix its gathering to the very time when it stands at its fullest strength and is most surely itself, most easily known, least likely to be confused with anything else. The holy day was also, without anyone needing to say so, the right day, the ripe day, the safe day. Ritual and good practice ran together, so that a person keeping the custom kept the caution as well, without ever having to reason it out. The calendar remembered for them when each plant was best and safest, and all they had to do was keep the feast. There was a further safety in this, easy to miss, because everyone gathered a given herb at the same fixed season. The gathering was done in company and in the open. Many hands at the same work at the same time, and the knowledge was checked and shared in the very doing of it. The young gathered beside the old on the appointed day, and were corrected on the spot, and any error stood out at once when a whole village was gathering the same plant together. The fixed season turned the gathering into a public and repeated lesson, and a plant taken at its own proper time was a plant taken under many knowing eyes. There was, besides the gathering, the blessing, and in many lands the plants were carried into the church itself to be hallowed. On the great summer feast of Our Lady in August, in the German and Alpine countries especially, the women bound bunches of herbs and flowers and carried them to be blessed at the altar, great sheaves that might hold a score of different plants or more. And the blessed bundles were then hung in the house, and the buyer, a little of them burned in sickness or in storm, kept as a guard through the year. This lovely custom did more than sanctify the herbs. It gathered the knowledge of them into a public and repeated act, in which the plants a household ought to know were named and bound and shown, year after year, before the whole community. The blessing of the herbs was, among everything else it was, a yearly lesson in which herbs mattered. Other seasons of the church year carried the people out among the growing things as well. In the days of the spring processions, when the parish walked its own boundaries and blessed the fields and the crops for the season to come, the whole community moved together through the very ground where the plants grew, the old walking the young along the familiar edges, naming as they went. To beat the bounds of the parish was to walk its every hedge and ditch and corner, and a child carried along learned the land and its plants in the doing, the holy walk and the plant lesson once again folded into one. Even the great feasts of the spring brought their greenery into the church and into the mind. Where no true palm grew for the Palm Sunday processions of the north, the people carried instead branches of the yew, or the willow, or the budding sallow, so that these plants too took their places in the holy year and were known to every worshipper by the very day they belonged to. The green of the season was carried indoors and blessed and borne aloft, and in this constant bringing of plants into the heart of worship, the whole community was reminded, again and again, of the green world just outside the church door, and of the particular plants that marked each turning of the sacred year. Over the calendar of the saints lay also the older calendar of the moon, which many who gathered herbs kept as carefully as they kept the feasts. Roots and the parts that grew downward were taken by long custom. As the moon waned and the plant's strength was thought to draw down into the earth, while leaves and flowers were gathered as the moon grew toward the full, and the strength was thought to rise. Whether or not the moon changed the virtue of a plant in any way that could be measured, the keeping of its rhythm gave the whole work of gathering a steady and unhurried order, a second and finer wheel turning within the great wheel of the year, and it meant that a gatherer was always working to a rule, never merely at random. The early feasts of the year set the times for sowing and for the first work in the garden, so that a goodwife knew to look to her seeds about one holy day, and to set her young plants about another, the whole labor of the growing year pegged to the familiar markers of the calendar. There were sayings for every turn of it, which crop to sow by which feast, which task to have finished before which saint's day came round, and a person who kept these markers kept, without effort, a sound and tested rhythm of work that the generations had proved. The calendar was a farming manual and a gardening manual as much as a book of devotions. Its practical wisdom and its holy days bound together past all separating. All of this timing, the feasts and the moons and the fixed days, did a quiet double work, the same double work we have seen in so much of this knowledge. On the surface it was custom and piety, and the keeping of holy time. Underneath, it was a system of rules that held the practical knowledge in place and passed it on. A plant gathered only at its proper season was a plant gathered when it was safest to know and best to use. A gathering that was also a feast was a lesson taught to the whole village at once. A knowledge tied to the unforgettable round of the holy year was a knowledge that could not easily be lost, for the year itself came round again and again to remind them. There was, too, a deep comfort in living by this shared calendar, a comfort that was itself part of its strength. To gather the same herb on the same holy eve that one's mother had gathered it, and her mother before her, was to feel oneself part of a long and unbroken order, held safe within a rhythm far older than any single life. The plants, the saints, the seasons, the moon, all turned together in one great and reassuring wheel, and a person moving with that wheel felt the ground firm beneath them. In a world of much hardship and much uncertainty, the calendar of the herbs was one of the things that made the year feel known and safe and shaped. And so the turning year itself became one more keeper of the knowledge that kept people well, remembering for them when each plant was ripe and safe, teaching them in its feasts and its processions, blessing their herbs at the altar, and holding the whole vast body of plant, learning within a shape so familiar and so often repeated that it could scarcely be forgotten. The safety of that world was written, in part, into its very calendar, into the holy days that told a people, without ever seeming to teach them anything at all, exactly when to walk out and gather what they needed. Let us turn now, gently, to the other side of all this, to the rare occasions when the knowledge failed, or was overwhelmed, and something did go wrong. We come to it not to frighten, for there is nothing here to fear, but because the truth of how seldom it happened, and why, is the very heart of everything we have gathered to consider tonight. Let us begin by admitting plainly that it did happen sometimes. No knowledge is perfect, and no watchfulness is unbroken, and in a world so full of dangerous plants there were, now and again, accidents. A child slipped past a watching eye and ate the bright berries. A hungry traveler in a strange country mistook one plant for another. A weary hand in the dark reached for the wrong jar. These things occurred. But the striking fact, the fact that should sit at the center of this whole evening, is how rarely they occurred. How few and far between such accidents were against the vast and constant nearness of the danger. A world drenched in poison lost remarkably few of its people to it, and that is the quiet marvel we are honoring tonight. When harm did come, it came most often to the very young, for a small child is curious and quick, and not yet wholly schooled, and it was the shining sweet berry, the one poison that did not warn the tongue with bitterness, that most often did the mischief. This is why, as we heard at the very beginning of our evening, those particular berries were the ones pointed out most sternly and most early, named and forbidden before almost anything else. The whole fierce watchfulness of the household around the smallest children was raised precisely because this was where the danger was greatest, and that watchfulness, though it could not catch every single case, caught very nearly all of them. Far more often than ignorance, it was hunger that undid people, and this is a gentler and sadder truth than any tale of carelessness. In the ordinary run of years, a family ate only what it knew, and knew enough to keep safe. But in the famine years, when the harvest failed, and the stores gave out, and the belly cried louder than the memory, people were driven to eat what in better times they would never have touched, the unfamiliar root, the doubtful weed, the plant left always alone until now. The knowledge had not failed. It had been overwhelmed by need. When we read of people poisoned by plants in the medieval records, it is very often the mark not of foolishness, but of desperation, of good knowledge pushed aside by a hunger too great to heed it. And it tells us less about what people did not know than about how hard some seasons were. The stranger and the traveler stood at a special risk, and their case shows, from the other side, just how local this saving knowledge really was. A person set down in an unfamiliar country, where the soil and the plants, and even the names ran different from home, lost some of the sureness that had kept them safe all their lives. For their deep knowledge was the knowledge of their own place, and did not always carry over. A root that was wholesome at home might have a dangerous cousin here that they had never learned to tell apart. The wise traveler knew this, and grew cautious in strange country, eating only the plainly familiar and asking the local people about the rest, borrowing, in effect, the knowledge of the place they had come to, since their own no longer wholly served them. And then there was one danger that all the plant knowledge in the world could not have caught, because it was not a matter of one plant mistaken for another at all. This was the sickness the old people called the Holy Fire, or St. Anthony's Fire, and its story is worth telling gently, for it shows exactly where the great system of knowledge reached its limit. The affliction came not from any wild poison plant, avoided or mistaken, but from the very grain the people lived on, from the rye of their daily bread. When a certain dark growth crept into the ear in the wet years and was ground up, unseen, into the flour, there was no strange leaf to spot, no bitter taste to warn, no look alike to tell apart. The bread looked like bread. The danger was hidden inside the most familiar and trusted food of all. The sickness that followed was a terrible one, and swept, in the worst years, through whole districts at once, and because no one could see its cause in the ordinary way. It wore for centuries the look of a visitation, a scourge sent from beyond, against which the plant knowledge of the wisest woman was simply powerless. An order of monks arose to care for those it struck, and the sufferers were carried to their houses to be tended, and the affliction took the name of the saint those monks served. It was said that moving the sick away from home sometimes eased them, and we can see now why it might, for away from home they were fed on different bread, though no one then could have known that was the cure. The whole thing stayed a mystery for a very long time, and was understood at last only in a far later age, when at last the small dark growth in the grain was recognized for what it was. It is worth pausing on why this one danger slipped through, when so many sharper ones were caught, for it tells us just how good the ordinary knowledge really was. Every danger we spoke of earlier, the hemlock, the nightshade, the false parsley, could be met by the eye and the nose and the naming, because each was a distinct plant that could be known and avoided. This danger could not, because it was not a plant to be avoided at all, but an invisible taint within a trusted one. The system of knowledge was built to tell good plants from bad, and it did that superbly. It was never built to see the unseeable, and only the unseeable defeated it. The exception, in other words, proves the very thing we have been saying all evening. Where the danger could be known, it was known and avoided. Only where it could not be seen at all did it do its harm. Set against the whole picture, the plain truth is that death by plant was, in that world, an uncommon thing. Far more people were lost to the ordinary hazards of a hard life, to the water and the fire and the cart, and the sickness that had nothing to do with any herb, than were ever lost to the poisons growing all around them. The old records that count such things bear this out, the accidental deaths falling overwhelmingly to drowning and to falls and to the common perils of labor, and only rarely to the mistaken plant. A landscape full of poison, walked by people who could not read, turns out to have been, in this one respect, a remarkably safe place to live. And it was safe for one reason only, because the people who lived in it knew it so well. And when the worst did happen, the response itself was not helpless, for the same knowledge that named the poisons knew something of their undoing. A household faced with a child who had swallowed a bad berry knew to act at once to bring the poison up again, with warm salted water or a known and gentle herb, and knew the plants and the broths thought to soothe and to strengthen the sufferer after. The counter-poisons we spoke of earlier were reached for, and the wise woman sent for in haste. None of this was sure, and much of it we would not use now. But it shows that even at the very edge of disaster, the people were not without knowledge, meeting even the rare accident with the same deep store of plant lore that had, in nearly every other case, kept the accident from ever happening at all. So we come away from this harder part of our evening not with fear, but with a deepened respect. The accidents were real, and we need not pretend otherwise, but they were few, and where they came most often from hunger, or from the curiosity of the very young, or from a danger no eye could have seen. The great body of ordinary plant knowledge did its work, quietly and well, year upon year, keeping a whole people safe among dangers we would find frightening to live beside. It was not perfect. It did not need to be perfect. It needed only to be good and shared and deeply learned, and it was all three. Let us turn now to the slow trickle of the written word, and to the herbals and leech books in which a little of this vast spoken knowledge was, at last, set down on the page. We have spent this whole evening among people who could not read, and among a knowledge that lived in memory and voice and hand rather than on any page. But there was, running alongside all of that, a thin and precious trickle of the written word, kept by the few who could write, and it is worth turning to now, both for its own sake, and because it is very largely through this trickle that we know anything at all of the great spoken ocean it flowed beside. The writing down of plant knowledge was old, far older than the medieval world, reaching back into the ancient books that the Middle Ages inherited and copied and treasured. Chief among them was a great work on the materials of medicine, written by a physician of the ancient world, that described hundreds of plants and their uses, and was copied by hand, again and again, for something like 1,500 years, passing from language to language and age to age, as the single most trusted authority on the green pharmacy. To possess a copy was to hold a fortune, and the monks and physicians who kept and copied it were the guardians of a thread that ran unbroken from the ancient world into their own. Beside that great work stood others of the ancient world, the vast natural history of a Roman writer who had gathered into his pages very nearly every scrap of plant lore his age could supply, and the illustrated herbals that traveled down the centuries under old and honored names. One such ancient treatise was given over entirely to a single plant, the betony, which the old world esteemed so highly against so many ills that a saying urged a man to sell his very coat and buy betony. Whatever the plant's true worth, the treatise shows how a single herb could gather about itself a whole small literature of praise, copied and recopied down the ages, carrying the reputation of the plant far beyond the places it grew. The old English lands had their own written physic as well, gathered into books we now call leech books, from the old word for a healer, which set down in the plain speech of the time long lists of ailments and the herbal remedies for them. One such book, put together in the 10th century, holds recipe after recipe of exactly the kind of knowledge we have been speaking of, the wound salves and the fever drinks and the cautions, some of it plainly drawn from the same deep folk tradition that lived on every tongue, another gathering of old remedies and charms from the same world preserves that very charm of the 9 herbs we heard earlier, caught and held on parchment before it could slip away, so that we can still read today what a person of that age might have chanted over a sickness 1,000 years ago. The monasteries were the great houses of this written knowledge, for there the ability to read and write was kept alive through the hardest centuries, and there the physic gardens were planted and the old books copied. A monk with a gift for it might spend his life copying out a herbal, letter by careful letter. And the physic gardens of the great religious houses grew the very plants the books described, so that the written word and the living plant stood side by side within the same walls. Verse herbals were made for the teaching of the young, the properties of the plants, set into memorable lines, so that a student might learn them as a kind of poem. And the famous schools of the South sent out their own texts on herbs and health that spread across the whole of Europe. Yet the written herbals of the medieval centuries carried within them a deep and revealing weakness, one that shows exactly why the spoken and living knowledge remained the greater and the more trusted. It was the problem of the pictures. A herbal was far more useful if it showed the plant as well as named it, and so the books were illustrated, but the illustrations were copied by hand from earlier books, which had themselves been copied from still earlier ones, and with each copying the drawing drifted a little further from the living plant. After a plant had been copied by many hands across many generations, none of whom had perhaps ever seen the plant itself, the picture might have become a strange and useless thing, a tangle of lines that resembled no plant on earth. A person could not safely tell one plant from another by such a picture, and everyone knew it, and so for the real work of knowing plants the book gave way, always to the living thing and the living teacher. This is worth dwelling on, for it goes to the very heart of our evening. The safety of the ordinary person did not, and could not, rest upon books. The books were few, and costly, and locked away, and could not be read by one person in 100, and even where they could be read their pictures could not always be trusted. The knowledge that actually kept people safe was the other kind, the spoken and walked and handled knowledge, learned from a mother and a hedgerow and a lifetime of looking. The written word was a fine and precious thing, but it followed the knowledge rather than leading it, catching a little of the great tradition and holding it, while the tradition itself rolled on, vast and unwritten, in the memory of a whole people. In time, and past the edge of the age we have mostly spoken of tonight, the written word grew far more powerful, when printing came and books could at last be made in numbers, and when a new care for accuracy sent artists back to draw the plants freshly from life. Herbals appeared with pictures so true that a plant could genuinely be known from them, and books of plants were printed at last in the common tongue, so that a person of ordinary means, if only they could read, might own a herbal of their own. One such English book, cheap and plainly written and hugely loved, put the knowledge of the herbs into the hands of thousands who had never had it in writing before, and though the learned sometimes frowned at it, it did a great work in spreading and preserving the old knowledge, just as the world that had carried it by voice was beginning to change. Alongside the printed herbals there grew up, in the houses of the gentry, another and more private kind of written knowledge, the receipt book, a manuscript kept by the lady of a house and handed down from mother to daughter, in which were written the family's own tried remedies and cordials and preserves, gathered from books and neighbors and long experience alike. These receipt books, filling slowly over a lifetime in a dozen different hands, were a meeting place of the two great streams. The book knowledge and the folk knowledge, set down side by side on the same page, a physician's careful recipe next to a cure learned from an old countrywoman. In them we can see, more clearly than almost anywhere else, how the written and the spoken knowledge came together at last. The still room and the study, joined in a single well-thumbed volume, kept for the practical use of a household. There was, all along, a quiet traffic between the written and the spoken, each feeding the other. The physicians and the monks who wrote the books did not draw all their knowledge from older books alone. They watched and they listened, and now and then they set down a remedy they had seen work in the hands of a country healer, so that a scrap of village wisdom found its way onto the parchment and was saved. And the traffic ran the other way as well, for where a literate person lived among the unlettered, a little of the book might pass into the common talk, a charm copied out for a neighbor, a remedy read aloud and remembered. The two streams, the written and the spoken, ran side by side down the centuries, mingling at the edges, each preserving something the other might have lost. It is worth remembering, too, that even the most learned physician, for all his shelf of books, depended in the end upon the unlettered gatherers who actually knew and found the plants. The doctor might read of a herb in his manuscript, but it was the herb woman of the market, or the root gatherer who roamed the countryside, who could lay the true living plant in his hand, and the physicians knew it and bought from them, and now and then grumbled that these plain folk knew the growing plants far better than the scholars ever did. The written knowledge and the walked knowledge leaned upon one another, and the grand tradition of the books would have been of little practical use without the humble people who could tell, out in the field, exactly which green thing the book had meant. Much of even this written knowledge was lost along the way, for a manuscript was a fragile thing, and fire and damp and war and simple neglect carried off a great many of them across the centuries. For every old herbal that survives to be read today, we may be sure that others perished utterly, their knowledge gone with them, and the books we have are only the fortunate remnant of a far larger written store. That so much came through it all is owed to the patience of the copyists, who by remaking each book by hand before the old copy crumbled kept the thread from breaking, passing the ancient words forward across the gulf of the centuries, one careful copy at a time. We owe those few writers a great debt, for without them this whole evening would have been impossible. The spoken knowledge, for all its vastness and its toughness, left almost no trace of itself, vanishing with the voices that carried it, and if it had all been spoken, and none of it ever written. We should know now almost nothing of how these people lived among their plants. It is only because a monk here, and a physician there, troubled to set a little of it down, only because a charm was caught on parchment, and a remedy copied into a leech book, that we can sit here tonight and speak of any of it at all. The written trickle was small beside the spoken ocean, but it is the trickle that reached us, and we read the ocean now by its light. And so the written word takes its rightful place in our story, neither the source of the knowledge nor the keeper of the people's safety, but a faithful and precious witness, a thin bright thread of ink running alongside the great dark river of memory, saving for us a little of what would otherwise have passed beyond all recall. The villager never needed the book, but we, looking back, need it very much, and are grateful to the patient hands that made it. Let us turn now, as our evening draws toward its close, to the long afterward of all this, to how the great knowledge was handed down, and how it slowly faded, and what small pieces of it linger with us even now. For a very long time, the knowledge passed on unbroken, exactly as we have described it passing, from mother to daughter and old man to boy, through the hedgerow and the kitchen and the round of the holy year, century after century with scarcely a change. A child of one age learned very nearly what a child of an age long before had learned, in very nearly the same way, so that a countrywoman of 1 century would have recognized at once the knowledge and the customs of a countrywoman many centuries removed. This was among the most stable and enduring bodies of knowledge that human beings have ever kept, and it lasted so long precisely because it was held not in fragile books, but in the living practice of whole communities, copying itself freely into every new child born among them. But it did fade, in the end, slowly and for many reasons together, and the fading is worth understanding gently, for it was no single blow but a long quiet ebbing. The common lands, where the poor had gathered their simples and learned their plants, were fenced and divided, and closed off over the long generations, and with the loss of the commons went some of the great open classroom in which the knowledge had been shared. People moved, in time, off the land and into the growing towns, where the hedgerow was far away and the old plants no longer grew at every doorstep, and a knowledge that lived by daily use began to loosen when the daily use was gone. Other things arose to take the place the old knowledge had filled. The apothecary's shop, and then, in time, the chemist's, offered remedies ready-made, to be bought rather than gathered. And a family that could buy its physic had less need to know the plants that made it. The physician grew more common and more trusted, and the reading of books more widespread, and slowly the balance tipped from the knowledge one carried in oneself toward the knowledge one could purchase or look up. None of this happened quickly, and none of it happened everywhere at once. But across the long, slow turning of the centuries, the great tradition thinned, passing out of the general possession of everyone and into the keeping of a few, the country herbalist, the old countrywoman, the enthusiast who gathered up the fading lore before it went. It is worth saying how recently, in the long reckoning of things, this knowledge was still alive and general, for it did not fade in some remote and misty past, but slipped away slowly. Within a handful of generations, near enough that the grandparents of people, now old, could still remember grandparents of their own who gathered and knew the plants in the old way. The great chain, 1,000 years long and more, did not snap. It simply thinned and loosened and let go, so gently that no one quite marked the moment it happened. Until one day the knowledge that had once belonged to everyone belonged to almost no one, and was remembered. Where it was remembered at all, as something quaint and old rather than as the ordinary competence of a whole people. The knowledge lasted longest in the places furthest from the changing world, in the remote glens and islands and mountain valleys, where the old life went on much as it always had. And it was there that the collectors of a later age found it still living, and wrote it down in the very last hour, taking from the lips of the old people rhymes and cures and plant names that reached back unbroken into the medieval world and far beyond. Much of what we know of the whole tradition we owe to these late gatherings, made just as the last people who held the knowledge whole were passing from the world, so that the memory was caught, quite literally, at the very edge of its vanishing. And yet it never wholly vanished, and this is a gentler note to rest on. A surprising amount of it lingers with us still, though we seldom notice it for what it is. The old plant names survive in our speech. The foxglove and the self-heal and the woundwort keeping their ancient meanings folded away inside them. The dangerous plants are dangerous still, and are still, in a quieter way, still taught. For what parent has not warned a small child not to eat the bright berries in the hedge, passing on, without knowing it, the very first and oldest lesson of all, the same firm no that a medieval mother spoke over a curious hand 1,000 years ago. Even the games of children still carry fragments of it, worn now to mere play. The daisy chain, the dandelion clock blown to tell a make-believe hour, the whistle made from a hollow stem, the old rhyme chanted over a buttercup held beneath the chin. All of these are the last soft echoes of a time when a child's play among the plants was also a child's first schooling in them. The lessons have drained out of the games, and few who play them now could name the plants or their old uses. But the games themselves survive, small green heirlooms handed down from that vanished world of deep and daily plant knowledge, kept alive by children who have no idea at all what it is they are keeping. The old plants themselves are still among us and still bear witness. The yew still stands dark in the churchyard, known to be poison, its long history of danger and of use unbroken. The foxglove is still grown in gardens for its beauty, and still everyone half remembers not to be meddled with. Deadly nightshade still shows its shining berries in the chalky south, and children are still told to leave them be. The whole cast of the plants we have named tonight goes on growing where it always grew, keeping its old dangers and its old virtues, whether or not the people passing know any longer what they are. There is, too, a quiet vindication that the passing centuries have brought to the old knowledge, for again and again the plants the country people trusted have been found, by a later and more searching age, to hold real virtue after all. The willow whose bark eased pain and fever was found to carry the very substance from which a famous medicine was later made. The foxglove that the wise women gave for the failing heart became, by careful study, a true medicine of the heart still used in refined form today. Plant after plant that the old herbalists had valued gave up under study, some kernel of the good that folk experience had found in it long before, so that the knowledge which a proud age had once dismissed as mere superstition turned out, in a great many cases, to have been quietly right all along. One of the most striking of these late vindications came from the very Leech book we spoke of a little earlier, that old English book of remedies from 1,000 years ago. It held a recipe for an eye salve, made of garlic and onion and wine and a portion of an ox's gall, brewed together in a vessel of brass and left to stand for 9 nights. Long afterward, in our own time, a group of scholars and scientists in an English laboratory, curious to see whether the old recipe did anything at all, made it up exactly as the book directed, and found, to their quiet surprise, that it worked upon certain stubborn bacteria that trouble modern medicine, and worked remarkably well. It was told calmly, as a piece of history rather than a marvel, and yet it left many who heard of it looking at the old remedies with a new and thoughtful respect. A great deal of the old plant knowledge survives, too, hidden in plain sight, inside things we no longer think of as medicine at all. The herbal teas we drink for comfort in the evening, the mint and the chamomile and the lemon balm, were the very infusions the goodwife once gave for a troubled stomach or a restless night. The bitter cordials and the flavored waters, the elderflower drink of early summer, the slow steeped through the autumn against the coming winter, all descend from the remedies and preserves of the old still room. We keep the plants and their uses still, in our kitchens and our gardens and our small evening comforts, long after we have forgotten that they were ever anything more than pleasant. Here and there the old physic gardens themselves are kept alive, tended now as living memorials rather than as working pharmacies, their beds still laid out with the very plants the monks and the wise women grew, labelled now with their names and their old uses for the visitors who walk among them. To stand in such a garden is to stand within a small surviving piece of that whole vanished world, the same plants growing in the same careful order, the knowledge that once lived in every head now written on little signs, but the green things themselves unchanged, patient and waiting exactly as they always were. And that, in the end, is the note on which this whole evening most wishes to rest. We began with a puzzle, how a people who could not read, living among plants that could kill, so rarely came to harm. We have followed the answer through the child's first lessons, and the naming of the dangers, through the rhymes and the shapes, and the tests, through the hedgerow, and the kitchen, and the market, through the wise woman's careful dose, and the watching of the beasts, and the round of the holy year, through even the rare and gentle account of the times it went wrong. And the answer, gathered up whole, is simply this: they knew, deeply, thoroughly, from earliest childhood, in a knowledge shared by nearly everyone and worn so smooth by daily use that it no longer felt like knowledge at all. They knew their green world, and knowing it, they were safe in it. It was not luck, and it was not backwardness, and it was certainly not ignorance. It was one of the great quiet competencies of our whole long history, and it deserves, at the very least, our wonder and our respect, and a peaceful hour of remembering before sleep. So let us lay the whole of it down now gently, as a gatherer sets down a full basket at the end of a long day. We have wandered a long way tonight, through a green and generous and dangerous world, and through the deep, warm, patient knowledge by which ordinary people made themselves at home in it. We have met the child learning the first firm gnaws at the mother's knee, and the death plants standing familiar along the lane, and the small careful tests that told a good plant from its double. We have heard the rhymes that carried the law, and the names that held it, and walked the hedgerow that taught it, and stood in the kitchen where the last careful choice was made. We have seen the watchful market, and the wise woman's dangerous store, the beasts that taught by grazing, and the holy year that kept the time. And we have looked, without fear, at the few and gentle occasions when something went amiss. It has been, from first to last, a story not of danger but of knowledge, and of how much safety a people can make for themselves out of nothing more than paying close and loving attention to the world they live in. There is nothing here you need to carry away, and nothing you need to remember. The knowledge these people held they held so that they might live. And we have gathered it up tonight only so that we might rest a while in the quiet company of it, in the low warm light of a world that knew its plants the way you know the faces of those you love. Let it settle over you now like a blanket, the hedgerow in the grey morning, the bundles of herbs drying in the loft, the small candle in the window, and the steady hands that knew, without thinking, exactly which leaf to reach for. All of it is safe now and finished and asks nothing more of anyone. Let your breathing slow, and let the day you have carried fall away from you, piece by piece, the way the light fades from a garden at dusk. There is no plant left to gather, and no danger left to name. The basket is full and set down by the door. The long knowledge of 1,000 quiet years has been spoken over, and may rest now, and so may you. Sleep well. The quiet apothecary will be back soon, with another quiet chapter. The candle in the window burns lower now, and the last of its light is soft and gold upon the drying herbs. Somewhere beyond the dark glass the hedgerow stands silent under the stars, keeping its green secrets safe until morning, as it has kept them, patiently, for 1,000 years.